Allais paradox. Imagine you're presented with two options. Option A offers you a guaranteed win of $1 million, 0 cents. Option B offers you an 89% chance of winning $1 million, 0 cents, and an 11% chance of winning nothing. Most would jump at the guaranteed $1 million, 0 cents without hesitation. Now, let's change the scenario. Option A offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million, 0 cents, and a 90% chance of winning nothing. Option B offers an 11% chance of winning $1 million, 0 cents, and an 89% chance of winning nothing. Despite the higher stakes in Option A, many people would choose Option B, the safer bet, even though it offers a smaller prize. This is the essence of the Allais paradox, a famous paradox in decision theory that reveals a contradiction between rational behavior and how people actually make decisions under risk. The paradox shows that our choices often don't align with expected utility theory, which predicts that we should consistently choose the option with the highest expected value. Why do we sometimes reject higher stakes options when logic would dictate otherwise? The Allais paradox highlights how our choices can be influenced by perceived risk and framing effects, making decision-making more complex than the pure logic of numbers. Let's explore the Allais paradox, where human psychology and rationality collide in unexpected ways. The Allais paradox was introduced by Maurice Allais, a French economist, in 1953. Allais was a Nobel Prize laureate in economics and is best known for his work on decision theory and the development of theories around risk behavior and rational decision-making. His paradox challenged the expected utility theory, which had been the dominant theory of decision-making for most of the 20th century. Expected utility theory assumes that individuals make decisions by considering the probabilities and values of all possible outcomes and selecting the option that maximizes their expected utility. According to this theory, the choices people make under risk should be consistent and predictable, driven solely by the objective value of the outcomes. However, Allais' paradox demonstrated that individuals often make choices that defy these predictions. The paradox comes from the fact that people frequently contradict their own preferences, depending on how choices are framed, even when the actual probabilities and expected values are identical. Allais' experiment revealed that people are not as rational as expected when it comes to risk-taking. They tend to prefer a certain outcome over a risky but higher value one, even when expected utility theory predicts they should do the opposite. This paradox has since become a foundational concept in the study of behavioral economics, decision-making and psychology, showing that human choices are often influenced by cognitive biases and irrational tendencies rather than strict logic. The Allais paradox challenges the fundamental assumptions of rational decision-making by showing that people's choices often violate the expected utility theory, which is used to model rational decision-making under uncertainty. Expected utility theory assumes that individuals will evaluate potential outcomes of decisions based on their probability and the utility or value they assign to those outcomes. In this theory, individuals should always choose the option that maximizes their expected utility, meaning they should consistently choose the option that provides the highest weighted value based on probabilities. The paradox occurs when people's actual choices do not align with this rational model. By presenting a choice between a certain outcome and a risky outcome, the paradox reveals that people often act in ways that seem irrational or inconsistent, even when the objective values are clearly defined. 1. The structure of the Allais paradox A. The basic setup. In his original experiment, Allais presented participants with two sets of choices, designed to highlight discrepancies in decision-making. The first set involves two options. Option A guaranteed win of $1 million, 0 cents. Option B, an 89% chance of winning $1 million, 0 cents, and an 11% chance of winning nothing. The second set of choices was Option A 10% chance of winning $5 million, 0 cents, and a 90% chance of winning nothing. Option B, an 11% chance of winning $1 million, 0 cents, and an 89% chance of winning nothing. According to expected utility theory, individuals should logically choose Option B in the first scenario, because the expected value of Option B is higher. 89% of $1 million, 0 cents, equals $890,000, 0 cents. And option A in the second scenario, since the 10% chance of $5 million, 0 cents, is worth more than an 11% chance of $1 million, 0 cents. However, in practice, many participants prefer option A in the first scenario, where the outcome is certain, and option B in the second scenario, where the stakes are higher. B. Expected utility theory versus real-world behavior. Expected utility theory predicts that people should be consistent in their decisions based on the relative expected values of the options. In the first scenario, option B should be the preferred choice because it offers a higher expected value. Yet, most people prefer the certainty of option A, despite the fact that it is less risky and offers a lower potential return. Similarly, in the second scenario, option A offers a higher expected value with its 10% chance of $5 million, 0 cents, but option B, with its 11% chance of $1 million, 0 cents, is preferred by many participants. This inconsistency reveals a psychological tendency to favor certainty in the face of risk, as seen in the first scenario, while still engaging in risky behavior when the stakes seem more tangible, as seen in the second scenario. 2. The psychological insights behind the Allais paradox. A. Certainty effect. One key psychological factor contributing to the Allais paradox is the certainty effect, which suggests that individuals place a disproportionately high value on outcomes that are certain. This means that people are more likely to choose an option that guarantees a smaller reward, certainty, than a higher but risky reward, even when the expected value of the risky option is higher. In the first set of choices, in the Allais paradox, many participants prefer option A, the guaranteed $1 million, 0 cents, over option B, the 89% chance of $1 million, 0 cents. Despite the fact that the expected value of option B is greater, the certainty of option A drives people's preferences. This aligns with psychological studies showing that people are risk-averse when faced with certainty, and risk-seeking when faced with uncertainty. B. Framing effect. Another contributing factor to the paradox is the framing effect, where the way a problem or decision is presented, or framed, influences people's choices. In the Allais paradox, the framing of the two options, whether they emphasize certainty versus risk, has a significant impact on the decisions people make. When the choices are framed in terms of certainty, guaranteed money, people tend to lean toward the safer option, even if it's suboptimal in terms of expected value. Conversely, when people are presented with a situation involving larger potential gains, even if uncertain, they may take on more risk despite the slightly smaller expected value. The way the options are framed leads individuals to make decisions that seem inconsistent with the principles of expected utility theory. C. Risk aversion and risk seeking. The paradox highlights how people exhibit both risk aversion in the face of certainty, preferring guaranteed outcomes, and risk-seeking behavior when faced with large, uncertain rewards, choosing the higher risk, higher reward option. This tendency can be explained through concepts like prospect theory, which suggests that people tend to overvalue certainty and underestimate the expected value of risky options when the outcome is certain. 3. The implications of the Allais paradox. A. Rethinking rationality in decision-making. The Allais paradox challenges the notion that people always make decisions based purely on logical utility. Instead, the paradox highlights the psychological and emotional factors that influence decision-making. Understanding how human preferences deviate from the rational model is crucial for fields such as economics, political science, healthcare, and finance. In particular, the paradox calls into question the applicability of expected utility theory as a model for real-world decision-making. If people's decisions are consistently swayed by risk preferences, emotional reactions, and framing effects, then predicting behavior based solely on utility maximization may not provide an accurate picture of how people make decisions. B. Behavioral economics and human irrationality. The Allais paradox is one of the cornerstones of behavioral economics, which focuses on understanding the irrational behaviors that deviate from traditional economic models. It shows that people often make decisions that contradict standard models of rationality, such as expected utility theory. By incorporating insights from psychology and cognitive science, behavioral economics seeks to explain why people might value certainty more highly than expected utility suggests, or why they might engage in risky behavior when they should act more conservatively. C. Practical applications in policy and marketing. The Allais paradox has practical implications for how policymakers, marketers, and financial analysts can influence decisions. Understanding the certainty effect and framing effects allows for the development of policies and strategies that account for human psychology, rather than assuming people will make perfectly rational decisions. For instance, nudge theory applies behavioral economics to guide people toward better decisions without restricting their choices, by framing decisions in a way that encourages optimal choices. 4. Conclusion. The Allais paradox and the complexity of human decision-making. The Allais paradox serves as a reminder that human decision-making is often not as straightforward as the rational models suggest. While expected utility theory provides a useful framework for understanding decisions under risk, the paradox reveals the complexity of human psychology and the influence of risk aversion, certainty preference, and framing effects. The paradox challenges our understanding of rationality and invites a more nuanced view of how people make choices in the real world. Antitrust paradox. In the world of market economics, competition is hailed as the driving force behind innovation, lower prices, and consumer choice. Yet, what happens when the very laws designed to foster competition, antitrust laws, end up having unintended consequences? The antitrust paradox presents a thought-provoking dilemma. When regulatory bodies enforce policies to break up monopolies and prevent anti-competitive practices, they often create market conditions that inadvertently harm consumers and stifle innovation. The paradox lies in the fact that, while antitrust laws aim to promote fair competition, too much regulation can inadvertently lead to less competition, higher prices, and fewer choices for consumers. For example, by breaking up large companies that have the resources to innovate and achieve economies of scale, antitrust regulations can disrupt industries and make markets less efficient. So, can regulation designed to protect competition actually hurt it in the long run? The antitrust paradox challenges our assumptions about the role of regulation in fostering healthy markets. Let's explore this paradox, where the rules of competition may sometimes do more harm than good. The antitrust paradox emerged in the context of the historical development of antitrust laws and their practical application. Antitrust laws, particularly in the United States, were created to prevent monopolistic practices and ensure that companies could not use their dominance to stifle competition. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was one of the first pieces of legislation designed to curb monopolies and promote fair competition by outlawing restraints on trade, price fixing, and other anti-competitive practices. The Clayton Act of 1914 followed, further tightening regulations and addressing practices like price discrimination and exclusive deals. For most of the 20th century, these laws were applied to prevent monopolies from forming in industries like railroads, oil, and telecommunications, with the goal of ensuring that consumers had access to low prices, innovative products, and choices from a variety of providers. However, as industries evolved and global markets became more interconnected, a new paradox began to emerge. Companies that were seen as monopolistic in the 20th century were often those that were able to use their size and influence to drive down costs, create efficiencies, and offer better products, challenging the notion that larger corporations were inherently anti-competitive. In recent decades, critics of antitrust enforcement have argued that overly aggressive regulation and attempts to break up monopolies can often create market inefficiencies, reducing competition in industries where large firms are actually providing greater benefits to consumers. This paradox raises fundamental questions about the balance between regulation and market dynamics, and whether the antitrust laws may need to evolve in response to modern economic realities. The antitrust paradox stems from the tension between competition policy, which aims to protect consumers and ensure fair competition, and the market efficiencies that arise from large companies and monopolistic structures. At first glance, antitrust laws seem like the ideal tool to promote consumer welfare, but the paradox emerges when these laws inadvertently reduce competition, stifle innovation, and increase costs for consumers. The following factors contribute to the antitrust paradox. 1. The evolution of antitrust laws and their original purpose. A. The birth of antitrust regulation. The idea of antitrust laws was born in the late 19th century, during the rise of major monopolistic corporations in the United States, such as Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and US Steel. These companies, by consolidating power and resources, were able to dominate entire industries and manipulate prices in ways that were harmful to consumers. The advent of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 was intended to break up monopolies and restore competition, ensuring that consumers had access to a variety of choices and affordable prices. For many years, antitrust enforcement focused on breaking up large companies that were seen as suppressing competition by engaging in practices such as price fixing, collusion, and market domination. The goal was to create a level playing field for smaller businesses and prevent the concentration of economic power in the hands of a few large firms. B. The rise of modern monopolies. However, by the mid-20th century, the world had changed. Technological advancements and globalization transformed industries, and many companies grew in size and scale to compete on a global stage. In some cases, larger firms were better able to innovate, create efficiencies, and offer products at lower prices. The argument that size equals anti-competitive behavior began to lose traction as companies that were once considered monopolies started providing significant consumer benefits. For example, in the 1980s, Microsoft came under scrutiny for its dominance in the personal computer operating system market. Critics argued that Microsoft's market power suppressed competition, but defenders pointed out that Windows and Office were helping to drive technological innovation and improving the productivity of businesses and consumers. 2. The costs of breaking up monopolies. A. Economies of scale and market efficiency. The antitrust paradox begins to emerge when you consider the benefits of economies of scale. Large corporations, by virtue of their size, often benefit from cost advantages that smaller competitors cannot replicate. These economies of scale allow companies to produce goods and services at lower costs, often passing those savings on to consumers through lower prices. When antitrust regulators break up large companies in an attempt to increase competition, they often create smaller firms that lack the same operational efficiencies. These smaller companies may not be able to leverage the same resources, technology, and market reach as their predecessors. In some cases, the breakup of large firms can increase costs for consumers, as smaller companies face higher production costs and are unable to achieve the same level of innovation and competition that the larger company provided. B. Reduced investment in research and development, R&D. Large companies are often able to invest significant resources into research and development, R&D, which fuels technological progress and drives product innovation. When these companies are broken up into smaller, competing entities, the overall R&D investment in the industry may decrease. Smaller firms may lack the capital or incentive to invest in long-term innovations, as they focus on short-term survival in a more fragmented market. The antitrust paradox arises when regulatory attempts to break up monopolies lead to less investment in innovation, which harms consumers in the long run. While the breakup of large firms might seem like a win for competition, it can result in the loss of technological advances, better products, and new services that large companies are uniquely capable of producing. 3. The role of mergers and acquisitions. A. In competition, A merges as a response to market pressure. Another key aspect of the antitrust paradox is the way that companies respond to market competition through mergers and acquisitions, M&A. In many cases, companies merge not to reduce competition, but to create a stronger competitive position in the face of changing market dynamics. For example, in the tech industry, mergers may enable companies to combine resources, expertise, and technologies, allowing them to better compete with larger global firms. Antitrust regulators may view these mergers with suspicion, fearing that they will lead to the reduction of competition. However, these mergers can sometimes increase market efficiency, leading to better products, lower prices, and improved services. The paradox occurs when regulatory actions meant to prevent monopolistic behaviors actually harm competition and consumer choice by restricting these strategic partnerships. B. The complexity of assessing market competition. In today's global economy, it is increasingly difficult for regulators to accurately assess the impact of mergers and acquisitions. Globalization, technological change, and digital platforms have led to markets where competition is not just national, but international. For example, a merger between two American tech companies might not significantly affect competition within the US, but it could be seen as a monopolistic threat to European or Asian competitors. This complexity often leads to regulatory actions that are out of step with the realities of modern markets. The antitrust paradox highlights the difficulty of balancing the desire to promote competition with the recognition that global competitiveness requires firms to grow, adapt, and innovate at scale. 4. The impact of antitrust regulation on consumer choice. A. The unintended consequences of regulation. The central premise of antitrust laws is to protect consumers by ensuring that competition is not restricted by monopolistic practices. However, the antitrust paradox emerges when this regulation leads to unintended consequences, such as higher prices and less choice for consumers. For example, when large companies are forced to divest their assets or split into smaller entities, they may lose the ability to offer consumers a broad range of products and services. Smaller companies that emerge after a breakup may not be able to provide the same product variety or quality as the larger consolidated firm. In such cases, the consumer benefits of increased competition are outweighed by the loss of choice and higher costs. B. The trade-off between efficiency and fairness. The antitrust paradox also reveals the trade-off between efficiency and fairness in market competition. While antitrust laws aim to create a fair playing field for all companies, sometimes the benefits of market efficiency, in terms of lower prices, more innovation, and better services, are sacrificed in the pursuit of fairness. The paradox occurs when regulators prioritize fairness and consumer welfare to the extent that they inadvertently harm consumers by reducing efficiency and limiting innovation. 5. Conclusion. Rethinking antitrust policy and market regulation. A. Finding the right balance. The antitrust paradox suggests that there needs to be a balance between regulation and market dynamics. While antitrust laws are essential for promoting competition and preventing monopolistic behavior, overly aggressive enforcement may actually stifle innovation, reduce efficiency, and harm consumers in the long run. The challenge is to create regulations that protect consumers while also allowing firms to grow, innovate, and adapt in a global economy. B. Evolving antitrust laws for modern markets. As markets become more complex, antitrust laws must evolve to reflect the realities of globalization, technology, and digital platforms. Regulators should focus on maintaining a balance between competition and market efficiency, while recognizing that large companies can sometimes serve the best interests of consumers by driving down prices and fostering innovation. The antitrust paradox highlights the need for smarter regulation that considers the broader economic landscape and long-term consequences for consumer welfare. Information paradox. Imagine a world where perfect market efficiency reigns supreme, where all buyers and sellers have equal access to information, and every decision leads to the best possible outcome. Now consider this. What if perfect information is actually harmful to decision-making and market efficiency? This is the information paradox, a contradiction that arises when information asymmetry and uncertainty, essential components of real-world markets, are removed. According to Kenneth Arrow, the renowned economist, perfect information may not lead to optimal decision-making, as unpredictability and individual biases are necessary for achieving efficient outcomes. In other words, when everyone knows everything, the value of information is diminished and the market may become inefficient. The information paradox challenges the assumption that more information always leads to better decisions and greater market efficiency. Could the uncertainty and imperfections of real-world markets actually create better outcomes? The paradox forces us to reconsider the role of information in economic systems, highlighting that too much information can sometimes create confusion and indecision. Let's dive into the information paradox, where the idea of perfect knowledge may be more harmful than beneficial in creating economic efficiency and optimal decisions. The information paradox was first articulated by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Kenneth Arrow in his 1963 work on market efficiency and decision-making. Arrow's work on information asymmetry explored how the distribution of information among buyers and sellers in a market affects the decision-making process and the overall efficiency of markets. He argued that perfect information, where every agent has access to all possible data, does not necessarily lead to optimal economic outcomes. Arrow's general possibility theorem, also known as Arrow's impossibility theorem, laid the foundation for the information paradox by demonstrating that no voting system can translate individual preferences into a collective decision that satisfies all reasonable conditions. Extending this idea to markets, Arrow recognized that when all agents possess perfect knowledge, they are not always able to make optimal decisions due to the complexities of interpreting and acting upon that knowledge. This paradox draws on the idea of decision-making under uncertainty, where real-world economic agents often operate under conditions of imperfect knowledge. Arrow's paradox suggests that when individuals or organizations have too much information or perfect knowledge, they may become paralyzed by choice, leading to inefficiency. Information overload, compounded by psychological factors and biases, can distort decision-making, causing agents to make suboptimal choices despite having access to all relevant data. Today, the Arrow information paradox remains influential in economics, decision theory, and market analysis, shaping our understanding of the limits of rational decision-making in markets and other collective systems. The Arrow information paradox centers around the relationship between information and decision-making in economic systems. In an idealized world, perfect information would allow individuals to make the most informed, efficient decisions. However, the paradox arises when the availability of perfect information leads to diminished efficiency and suboptimal outcomes. This contradiction highlights the complex role that information plays in decision-making processes and market dynamics, challenging traditional economic theories that suggest that more information leads to better decision-making. 1. Perfect information and its assumptions. The ideal of perfect information. In traditional economic models, perfect information is considered a prerequisite for market efficiency. The assumption is that when all agents in a market have access to all relevant information, they can make optimal decisions. For instance, consumers would be able to make the best purchasing choices based on price, quality, and other factors, while producers would know the optimal level of output to satisfy demand. In this model, market prices serve as signals that reflect the true scarcity of goods, helping buyers and sellers make efficient decisions. The assumption of perfect information forms the foundation of many neoclassical economics models, where efficiency and optimality are guaranteed as long as all agents are perfectly informed. The limits of perfect information. Arrow's paradox begins to challenge this assumption by arguing that perfect information is not necessarily a guarantee of optimal decision-making. When all agents in a market possess the same level of information, there is no uncertainty left, and decision-making becomes rigid, reducing the flexibility and adaptability that are often required in real-world situations. In an ideal world with perfect information, everyone would theoretically make the same decision when presented with the same data. However, people interpret information differently due to factors like cognitive biases, emotions, and personal preferences. These subjective factors often lead to imperfect decisions even when the available data is flawless. This is where the paradox emerges. Perfect information does not necessarily lead to better outcomes because the absence of uncertainty and individual variation limits the richness of decision-making. 2. Information asymmetry in real-world markets. The role of information asymmetry. In most real-world markets, information is unevenly distributed between buyers and sellers, a phenomenon known as information asymmetry. This situation leads to the creation of market failures when certain participants have an advantage in terms of the information available to them. Sellers might have more information about the quality of a product than buyers, leading to situations where consumers cannot make fully informed choices. This is common in markets for used goods, insurance, and financial products. Arrow's paradox suggests that asymmetric information, rather than perfect information, may be necessary for efficient decision-making in these markets. When one party has better information, they are incentivized to act strategically, creating opportunities for mutual benefit. Asymmetric information also enables negotiation, bargaining, and contract design to play a key role in making decisions. In these situations, uncertainty about the true nature of goods or services drives the search for new information and innovative solutions, which enhances the overall efficiency of markets. The role of uncertainty and risk in markets where information is not perfect. Agents are forced to make decisions based on uncertainty and risk. This is a natural part of real-world decision-making. Insurance markets are a prime example of this, where companies offer products to cover potential losses that are uncertain. People buy insurance policies because they are unable to predict the exact likelihood of future events, such as car accidents or health issues, and insurance companies in turn use probability and risk analysis to assess the likelihood of claims. When information is perfect and uncertainty is removed, decision-making becomes constrained, as agents no longer have to adapt to new information or unforeseen events. In contrast, the presence of uncertainty in markets allows for innovation, as businesses and consumers develop new strategies to manage risk and gather the necessary data to make decisions. 3. The paradox of overinformation. information overload and decision paralysis. The arrow information paradox also explores the idea of information overload, where having too much information leads to decision paralysis and inefficiency. In some cases, an overabundance of information can hinder decision-making by overwhelming individuals, making it difficult for them to distinguish between relevant and irrelevant data. This leads to a phenomenon called analysis paralysis, where people delay or fail to make decisions altogether because they are bombarded with too many options or too much conflicting information. Digital markets, for example, are rife with information overload. Consumers often have access to thousands of product reviews, price comparisons, and product specifications, but this information can become overwhelming, leading to indecision and suboptimal choices. In these cases, the paradox becomes clear. More information does not necessarily lead to better decisions. B. Cognitive biases and limited rationality. Despite having access to abundant information, human decision-makers are often influenced by cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias, seeking information that confirms existing beliefs, and anchoring, relying too heavily on the first piece of information encountered. These biases distort the decision-making process, leading individuals to make irrational choices even when they are inundated with information. In fact, the more information people have, the more likely they are to engage in biased thinking, further diminishing the efficiency of decision-making. 4. Implications for market design and policy. A. Efficient market design. The arrow information paradox has important implications for market design and policy making. It suggests that perfect information may not always lead to optimal outcomes, and that uncertainty, risk, and asymmetric information can actually promote market efficiency. Policymakers need to recognize that removing all uncertainty and striving for complete transparency may not always improve market outcomes. Instead, they should focus on fostering environments where information flows adequately, enabling people to make informed decisions without overwhelming them with excessive data. B. Addressing information asymmetry. Given that information asymmetry is often a reality in most markets, policymakers can design mechanisms to bridge the gap. This might include regulations requiring companies to disclose key information to consumers, as well as creating systems to encourage information sharing and transparency while still allowing for flexibility in decision-making. Moreover, education and training programs can help individuals navigate complex information systems and make better decisions. C. The role of technological innovation. The rise of artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning is changing the way markets handle information. By automating the process of information gathering and decision-making, AI can help people make better choices without being overwhelmed by data. However, the arrow information paradox still holds, as even with advanced technologies, decision-making is still influenced by biases and the subjective interpretation of data. 5. Conclusion. Bootstrap Paradox. In a competitive market, companies are expected to fight for customers by offering the best price and quality. But what if, in a duopoly, two companies are locked in an endless battle for supremacy, and both end up setting prices so low that neither can make a profit? This is the crux of the Bootstrap Paradox, a situation in economic theory where two firms, each offering a homogeneous product, compete by undercutting each other's prices, driving the price down to the point where it matches the marginal cost of production. In theory, this leads to a perfectly competitive outcome. But the paradox is that both companies lose out. They cannot make a profit despite the intense competition. How can perfect competition lead to a situation where no one benefits, even when there are only two firms in the market? The Bootstrap Paradox shows us that in certain conditions, price competition can actually harm all players involved. Let's explore the Bootstrap Paradox, where economic theory meets real-world strategy in a counterintuitive twist that challenges our assumptions about pricing and market competition. The Bootstrap Paradox was first formulated by the French economist Joseph Bertrand in 1883. It arose in the context of his exploration of market competition in a duopoly, a market with only two firms. Bertrand sought to show what happens when firms compete purely on price and offer an identical product to consumers. The paradox comes from Bertrand's assumption that firms in a duopoly would engage in perfect price competition. In most economic models, monopolies and oligopolies can set prices high because they hold significant market power. However, in a duopoly, Bertrand argued that both firms would engage in undercutting each other's prices, and the process would continue until the price drops to the marginal cost of production, leaving both firms with no profit. This outcome is in stark contrast to the behavior predicted by Cournot competition, which assumes that firms compete by setting quantities rather than prices. The Bertrand model shows that under certain conditions, competition based solely on price leads to an inefficient outcome, where firms' incentives to undercut each other actually harm their profitability. Though the Bertrand paradox has been critiqued and refined over time, it remains an important contribution to the field of industrial organization and microeconomics, demonstrating the potential flaws in price-based competition and highlighting the limitations of classical competitive models. The Bertrand paradox is a critical concept in economic theory that demonstrates how intense price competition between firms can lead to a suboptimal market outcome, even in a duopoly where firms should theoretically have market power. The paradox arises when two firms, each offering an identical or nearly identical product, engage in price competition. The model assumes that consumers will always choose the firm that offers the lowest price, and firms will continue to undercut each other until the price reaches the marginal cost of production, at which point neither firm can make a profit. To understand why this happens, we need to look at the components of the Bertrand model, the assumptions behind it, and its implications. 1. The basics of Bertrand competition. A. The Bertrand model of competition involves two firms, each producing an identical product and trying to maximize their profits by setting prices. Consumers are assumed to always buy from the firm that offers the lowest price. The model assumes that both firms have the same marginal cost of production, and that consumers will buy from the firm with the lowest price even if the quality of the products is identical. In Bertrand's model, the firms engage in price competition. If one firm sets a price slightly lower than the other, it will attract all consumers, assuming the product is the same. The other firm, seeing its potential customers disappearing, will lower its price in response, and this process continues until the price reaches the marginal cost, the price at which firms can no longer make a profit. The key assumption here is that consumers are perfectly informed and always seek the lowest price, meaning they have no loyalty to any particular firm and will switch based solely on price differences. In a monopolistic or oligopolistic market with a single firm setting the price, the firm can set a price above marginal cost to earn a profit. However, in a duopoly with perfect price competition, this advantage vanishes as the two firms continually undercut each other's prices. B. The result: zero profit equilibrium. The result of this competitive process is that the price eventually reaches the marginal cost of production. At this point, the firms are no longer able to make any profit. In this zero profit equilibrium, both firms produce the product at cost, and while consumers benefit from the lowest possible price, the firms do not gain any profit from their production. This is where the paradox lies. In traditional economic models, competition between firms is expected to drive efficiency and lower prices. But in the case of the Bertrand paradox, the competition is so fierce that it results in no profits for either firm. This outcome seems counterintuitive, because the firms are competing based on price, which theoretically should benefit consumers and promote efficiency. But in reality, it harms the firms, leaving them with no profit and no incentive to innovate or improve their product. 2. Key assumptions in the Bertrand model. A. Identical products. A critical assumption in the Bertrand paradox is that the two firms are offering identical products. In the real world, products often differ in quality, branding, or customer service, which may allow firms to charge a higher price for differentiation. However, the Bertrand model assumes that there is no differentiation between the products and consumers are solely concerned with price. In industries where product differentiation exists, such as the automobile or technology industries, firms can charge a premium for their unique features. However, in the case of the Bertrand paradox, when the products are identical and consumers are fully aware of their choices, price becomes the sole factor in their decision-making. B. Perfect competition and consumer behavior. Another assumption is that consumers are perfectly informed about the prices being charged by both firms. This means that there are no transaction costs or barriers to entry, and consumers will always choose the firm offering the lowest price. In the real world, there are often costs associated with switching providers, such as the time spent researching options or the inconvenience of changing suppliers. These frictions can soften the intensity of price competition and allow firms to maintain some level of profitability. However, in the Bertrand model, these complexities are ignored, which leads to the zero-pony equilibrium. C. No collusion between firms. The model also assumes that the two firms are competing independently and are not engaging in price collusion. In reality, firms in an oligopoly may collude or tacitly agree to set prices at a level higher than marginal cost in order to increase profits. However, the Bertrand paradox assumes that firms are acting in self-interest, with no collusion or cooperation between them. If firms were able to coordinate prices, they could avoid the competitive race to the bottom and maintain profits. But in the Bertrand framework, this is not possible. 3. Implications of the Bertrand paradox. A. Perfect competition and inefficiency. The Bertrand paradox demonstrates that perfect competition in a duopoly, under the assumption of identical products and perfect consumer information, leads to inefficiency. While consumers benefit from the lowest possible price, the firms suffer from a lack of profit, which can stifle innovation and reduce the incentives for quality improvement. This scenario contrasts with other market structures, such as monopolies or oligopolies, where firms can set higher prices and use their profits to fund research and development or marketing. B. Real-world application and limitations. In the real world, markets rarely operate under the strict conditions assumed in the Bertrand model. There are often barriers to entry, product differentiation, and imperfect information that mitigate the effects of perfect price competition. In industries where differentiation is significant, e.g. smartphones, automobiles, firms can avoid the zero-promised equilibrium and retain some level of profitability, even if they face strong competition. Additionally, price competition in industries with only two firms, a duopoly, is relatively rare. Most industries have multiple players, which leads to a more complex interaction of strategies, including price matching, advertising, and loyalty programs. As a result, the Bertrand model may not fully reflect the dynamics of many real-world markets, but it does provide an interesting theoretical insight into the effects of price competition in a duopolistic setting. B. Policy implications. The Bertrand paradox has implications for antitrust policy and market regulation. In industries where price competition leads to a zero-profit equilibrium, regulators may need to consider the long-term sustainability of firms and ensure that companies are not driven to unsustainable pricing practices that harm their financial viability. At the same time, policymakers must also be cautious of price fixing or collusion, which can lead to higher prices and reduced consumer welfare. 4. The Bertrand paradox and market strategies. A. Price versus quantity competition. The Bertrand paradox highlights a key distinction between price competition and quantity competition, as explored in Cournot competition. In the Cournot model, firms compete by deciding on the quantity of a good to produce, which in turn affects the price. This leads to a different equilibrium than the Bertrand model, where firms set the price. The Cournot equilibrium typically results in higher prices and profits for firms, as the firms are not engaged in the intense undercutting that characterizes price competition in the Bertrand model. In many real-world markets, firms do not simply compete on price, but also on quantity, quality, and innovation. The Bertrand paradox may not fully reflect these factors, but it remains an important theoretical model for understanding the effects of price-based competition in a duopoly. Brace's paradox. Imagine a city that decides to build a new road to ease traffic congestion. Logically, the more roads you have, the easier it should be to get from one point to another. But what if I told you that adding a new road could actually make traffic worse? This is the heart of Brace's paradox, a phenomenon in network theory where adding an extra route to a traffic system can lead to worse overall flow rather than improving it. It seems counterintuitive. We would expect that increased capacity would help relieve congestion. However, according to Brace's paradox, when individuals act in their own self-interest, they may inadvertently create worse traffic by choosing the easiest path, leading to longer travel times for everyone. This paradox is not limited to traffic systems. It can apply to any situation where multiple agents, people, companies, or entities optimize their own choices within a larger system. How can individual rational decisions result in collective inefficiency? Let's explore the Brace's paradox, where the drive for optimization in a network can unexpectedly lead to worse outcomes and inefficiency. Brace's paradox was first introduced by Dietrich Brace, a German mathematician, in 1968. The paradox arose as a counterexample in the field of network theory, which studies how systems of interconnected elements, such as roads, electrical grids, or computer networks, function. Brace was studying traffic flow in urban areas and hypothesized that adding a new road or route could sometimes increase congestion rather than alleviate it. Brace's paradox is based on the idea that when individuals or agents in a system choose paths based solely on their own self-interest, they may not consider the effect of their choices on the system as a whole. Brace used traffic networks as a simple model to demonstrate this idea. The paradox can be summarized as follows. In a network where each person seeks the shortest, least congested path, adding extra routes may encourage people to choose paths that seem optimal for them individually, but that ultimately create congestion and inefficiency for everyone else. Since Brace's original paper, the paradox has been widely recognized in transportation systems, economics, and even communication networks. It has led to a reconsideration of optimal network design, showing that in some cases, removing or restricting access to certain paths can improve overall system performance, rather than adding more options. The paradox is often used to demonstrate the importance of considering system-wide effects when designing networks or systems where individual agents have competing interests. Brace's paradox occurs in networks, especially in systems like traffic flow, transportation systems, and even communication networks, where multiple agents, drivers, businesses, or individuals make independent decisions based on their own self-interest. The paradox highlights how adding capacity to a network, for example, building new roads or adding new routes, can sometimes result in worse overall efficiency due to the actions of individuals optimizing their own paths. At first glance, this may seem illogical. If you add a new road to a city's network, you would expect it to reduce congestion and improve overall traffic flow. But the reality, according to Brace's paradox, is that individual rational decisions can lead to collective inefficiency, causing greater congestion in the system as a whole. 1. Understanding the paradox in traffic systems. In the basics of traffic flow optimization, in traffic systems, drivers tend to make decisions based on what they believe is the quickest or least congested route. This kind of decision-making is typically based on self-interest, meaning that each driver will choose the path that minimizes their own travel time. In traditional traffic theory, adding extra lanes or new routes to a road network should reduce overall travel time for drivers, assuming that the new paths are less congested. However, the Brace paradox suggests that adding a new road can have an opposite effect. It can actually increase travel times for everyone in the system. The paradox occurs because, in a network, the individual behavior of drivers does not always align with the collective well-being of all drivers. When a new road is added, it might initially appear to offer a quicker route, but the redistribution of traffic can create bottlenecks or encourage a pattern of behavior that leads to worse congestion for the entire network. B. An example of Brace's paradox. Imagine a city with two main routes, Route A and Route B. If everyone follows the shortest route, both routes will be equally congested and travel times will be balanced. However, if a new road, Route C, is added to the network that offers a quicker path, drivers might shift their routes to use Route C. While it seems that this should improve travel times, the overall flow of traffic can be disrupted. As more drivers choose Route C, the overall congestion increases in that area, as more cars now have to share the same limited space. The result is that, while individual drivers may save time by using Route C, the overall system performance decreases. The new route causes more congestion and longer travel times for all drivers involved. This outcome occurs because drivers, seeking to optimize their own travel times, don't consider the system-wide impact of their decisions. The new road, in this case, doesn't help. Instead, it exacerbates the network inefficiency. 2. The underlying principles of the paradox. Nash equilibrium and traffic behavior. Nash equilibrium in traffic systems. The key to understanding Brace's paradox lies in the concept of Nash equilibrium, a concept from game theory developed by mathematician John Nash. In game theory, a Nash equilibrium occurs when each player or agent in a system makes the best possible decision for themselves given the choices of others, and no one can improve their situation by changing their strategy unilaterally. In the context of traffic flow, The Nash equilibrium occurs when each driver selects the route that minimizes their own travel time, taking into account the behavior of other drivers. However, the paradox arises because this equilibrium doesn't necessarily lead to the best overall outcome for the system. When each driver optimizes their individual travel time, the result is not a globally efficient traffic flow, but rather a suboptimal situation where the collective choices lead to increased congestion. B. Self-interest versus system efficiency. The paradox highlights a central issue in networked systems. Individual rationality does not always lead to collective rationality. Drivers, acting in their own self-interest, may create traffic patterns that lead to a worse overall outcome for the entire system. If everyone selects the best individual path, it can lead to a traffic jam or congestion that no one anticipated. In many cases, the optimum solution for reducing overall travel time in a network may require restrictions or limits on the freedom of individual agents to make completely self-interested decisions. Braze's paradox suggests that adding new options, such as new routes, can sometimes distract drivers from the most efficient path and lead to overall inefficiency. In some cases, removing or restricting access to certain routes can actually improve traffic flow and reduce travel times. 3. Broader applications of Braze's paradox. A. Economic and network systems. Braze's paradox is not limited to traffic systems. It has broader applications in any network where multiple agents make independent decisions. For example, in communication networks, electric grids, and even financial systems. The paradox can occur when individuals or entities act in their own self-interest, leading to inefficiencies in the system as a whole. In these systems, the introduction of new pathways or options can disrupt the balance of the system, leading to congestion, resource depletion, or inefficiency. Just like in traffic flow, the addition of a new route in a communication network or economic system may seem beneficial at first, but can cause negative consequences when individuals or entities optimize their behavior without considering the collective impact. B. Environmental and social systems, Braze's paradox, can also apply to environmental and social systems. For example, when governments introduce new programs or policies, they may inadvertently create new inefficiencies by encouraging individuals or groups to act in ways that increase congestion, reduce cooperation, or harm the overall ecosystem. In social systems, the paradox may arise when people pursue their own self-interest without considering the long-term impact on the community or environment, ultimately leading to a suboptimal outcome. TC, Traffic Management and Urban Planning. Understanding. Braze's paradox is crucial for traffic management and urban planning. It challenges the traditional assumption that more roads or increased infrastructure always lead to better traffic flow. Planners must consider how new roads or changes to the system might redistribute traffic and affect overall efficiency. Sometimes, restricting access to certain roads or creating managed lanes might improve traffic flow more effectively than adding new routes. 4. Solutions to the paradox. System-wide optimization. A. Efficient network design. To mitigate the effects of Braze's paradox, system-wide optimization is key. In traffic systems, this could involve traffic flow management, smart traffic lights, or dynamic pricing on toll roads to regulate the flow of traffic and prevent overuse of certain routes. In communication networks, optimizing for efficient data flow may require better coordination between different users or agents. B. Collaborative decision-making. One possible solution to the paradox is to encourage collaborative decision-making among agents within the system. By considering the collective benefit of all participants rather than optimizing individually, the system can reach a more efficient equilibrium. This can be facilitated through cooperative strategies or incentive structures that reward individuals for making decisions that benefit the overall network. C. The role of regulation and coordination. In some cases, regulation and centralized coordination may be necessary to ensure that the system operates efficiently. For example, imposing restrictions on certain routes or implementing pricing schemes that limit congestion could help mitigate the inefficiencies introduced by Braze's paradox. 5. Conclusion. Understanding the implications of Braze's paradox. A. Rethinking network optimization. Braze's paradox forces us to reconsider the assumptions behind network optimization. It demonstrates that adding capacity or increasing options is not always the solution to inefficiency. In fact, sometimes reducing options or restricting access can lead to better overall system performance. B. A cautionary tale for complex systems. The paradox also serves as a cautionary tale for designing complex systems, whether in transportation, communication, or economics. It shows that individual actions, even if rational on their own, may not always lead to optimal outcomes for the system as a whole. In such systems, careful planning, system-wide optimization, and coordinated decision-making are essential to avoid inefficiencies and resource depletion. Deaton paradox. In a world where economic growth is often considered the key to improving well-being, the Deaton paradox challenges this assumption. How can a country experience continued economic expansion while seeing no real improvement in the health and quality of life of its population? This paradox, named after economist Angus Deaton, highlights the disconnect between rising income levels and the declining health of certain segments of society. Despite a growing economy, increasing wealth inequality, inadequate access to healthcare, and rising rates of chronic disease seem to leave many people behind, particularly in developed countries. If economic growth and rising standards of living are supposed to result in better health outcomes and greater happiness, why do we see so many people, especially in the lower rungs of the economic ladder, suffering from poor health, stress, and social inequality? The Deaton paradox forces us to reconsider the role of income and economic growth in shaping well-being and health outcomes, raising critical questions about economic policy, distribution of wealth, and the true nature of progress. Let's explore the Deaton paradox, where rising prosperity does not always translate into greater health or happiness for all. The Deaton paradox is named after Angus Deaton, a prominent economist who, along with his colleague Anne Case, highlighted the complex relationship between economic growth and health outcomes. Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2015, has conducted extensive research on health economics and poverty. His work focused on the paradoxical observation that, while many nations have seen significant economic growth over the past few decades, there has been no corresponding improvement in health outcomes for certain demographic groups, particularly in developed countries like the United States. Deaton and Case's studies revealed that, in the US, rising income inequality and social stratification were contributing to worsening health outcomes, particularly among the middle class and lower income groups. They found that, instead of improving quality of life, economic growth and higher income levels were not equally distributed, leading to health disparities between the rich and the poor. This work has spurred debate about the true nature of economic progress and whether growth alone is sufficient to improve the overall well-being of a population. In Deaton's view, traditional measures of economic growth, such as GDP, are not sufficient to explain well-being. Rather, a focus on equality, healthcare access, and social mobility is necessary to understand the true impact of growth on society's overall health and quality of life. The Deaton paradox exposes the disconnect between economic growth and well-being, particularly in relation to health outcomes. While it is commonly assumed that rising income and economic prosperity result in better health, the paradox reveals that economic growth, in and of itself, does not necessarily lead to better quality of life for everyone. The following are key elements that explain the paradox and its broader implications. 1. Economic growth versus health outcomes. Rising GDP, falling health. In many countries, especially the United States, economic growth has not resulted in improved public health for large portions of the population. Instead, health inequalities have widened, particularly among lower impact groups and minorities. Despite rising GDP, life expectancy and health outcomes for certain demographic groups have either stagnated or declined. For instance, Deaton's research revealed that middle-aged white Americans with lower educational levels were seeing higher rates of drug overdoses, suicides, and heart disease, even as the economy grew. This counterintuitive trend calls into question the idea that economic growth automatically leads to improved living standards for all. The focus on income growth and consumerism as markers of success has resulted in societal neglect of the structural issues that underpin public health, such as access to healthcare, education, affordable housing, and clean environments. In many cases, these systemic issues exacerbate the health disparities that contribute to the Deaton paradox. B. The role of income inequality. One of the central themes of the Deaton paradox is the impact of income inequality on overall health outcomes. As income inequality widens, it leads to disparities in healthcare access, nutrition, and housing. Those in the lower income brackets are more likely to suffer from chronic diseases, mental health issues, and poor physical well-being due to their inability to access quality healthcare, nutritious food, and safe living conditions. Economic growth, when it benefits only a small segment of the population, leads to greater social stratification, with the wealthy enjoying better healthcare and living conditions, while the poor face increasing levels of stress and poor health. This widening gap between the haves and the have-nots creates a vicious cycle, where disadvantaged groups face poorer health outcomes, which in turn reduce their opportunities for economic mobility and well-being. 2. Health is more than just income. A. The importance of health systems and access to care. The Deaton Paradox emphasizes the need to look beyond income and economic growth when assessing well-being. A key factor contributing to health outcomes is the quality and accessibility of a country's healthcare system. In countries with well-developed and equitable healthcare systems, universal healthcare access can mitigate the effects of economic inequality, ensuring that all individuals, regardless of income, have access to preventive care, treatment, and mental health services. However, in countries like the United States, where access to healthcare is often tied to employment status and income, the healthcare system does not serve the needs of the entire population. Even as the economy grows, low-income individuals and minorities struggle with lack of access to care, leading to poorer health outcomes. The Deaton Paradox thus highlights the importance of improving healthcare systems to ensure that economic growth leads to better health for all, rather than exacerbating existing disparities. B. Social determinants of health outcomes are determined by a wide range of social factors beyond just income levels. These include education, social support, environmental conditions, and personal behaviors. For example, education is a key determinant of health literacy, which affects an individual's ability to make informed decisions about their health. Similarly, social support networks, such as family, community ties, and social capital, have been shown to improve mental health and resilience, ultimately contributing to better physical health. The Deaton Paradox underscores that economic growth alone cannot address the broader social determinants of health. For growth to translate into improved well-being, social policies must address inequalities in areas such as education, housing, employment opportunities, and access to nutritious food. In other words, economic growth must be accompanied by social reforms that address the underlying causes of health disparities. 3. The psychological and social effects of economic growth. A. The stress of inequality. While economic growth may improve the overall standard of living in a society, it can also exacerbate the psychological toll of inequality. Studies have shown that societies with high levels of income inequality tend to have higher levels of stress, mental health disorders, and social unrest. For example, the stress of living in poverty or struggling with job insecurity can contribute to chronic health conditions like hypertension, depression, and heart disease. This psychological toll is particularly evident in the United States, where the wealth gap has steadily increased over the last few decades. As the rich become richer and the poor become poorer, those in disadvantaged groups experience greater stress, lack of opportunity, and social isolation, all of which are harmful to mental health and physical well-being. B. The culture of consumerism. Another aspect of the Deaton Paradox is the rise of consumerism in modern economies. As economies grow, there is often a shift toward consumer-driven growth, where consumer spending drives the economy. This can create a culture where material success is prioritized over social connections, personal well-being, and mental health. The pursuit of wealth and material goods can contribute to stress and anxiety, leading to negative health outcomes despite economic growth. Additionally, consumerism encourages a focus on individual success and competition, which can exacerbate social inequality and mental health problems. The Deaton Paradox calls attention to the need for a shift away from a consumer-driven economy toward one that prioritizes community well-being, mental health, and social equality. 4. The role of public policy in addressing the paradox. A. Redistributive policies. To address the Deaton Paradox, there is a growing call for redistributive economic policies that promote equality and social mobility. Progressive taxation, universal healthcare, affordable education, and living wages are essential components of a policy framework that seeks to ensure that economic growth benefits all members of society rather than just the wealthy few. By addressing the structural barriers to health and social mobility, these policies can help reduce the negative effects of income inequality on health outcomes. B. Rethinking economic growth. The Deaton paradox also suggests that we need to rethink the way we measure economic success. Instead of focusing solely on GDP growth, policymakers should focus on metrics that reflect quality of life, such as life expectancy, mental health, income equality, and access to healthcare. These measures would better reflect the true impact of economic growth on societal well-being and ensure that growth leads to improvements in health and quality of life for all citizens. 5. Conclusion. The limits of economic growth in improving well-being. A growth without equity. The Deaton paradox underscores the idea that economic growth, while essential for improving living standards, is not sufficient on its own to ensure better health and well-being for all members of society. Income inequality, access to healthcare, and the broader social determinants of health must be addressed in order for economic growth to lead to improved public health. B. The need for a holistic approach. The paradox calls for a holistic approach to economic development that integrates social equity, healthcare access, education, and environmental factors. Only by addressing these broader determinants can we ensure that the benefits of economic growth are felt by everyone in society, and that growth translates into better health and greater well-being for all. The graphic economic paradox. What if I told you that population growth, something that's typically seen as a sign of a thriving economy, could actually lead to economic stagnation and declining standards of living in some countries? The demographic economic paradox presents a curious scenario. While many countries have historically viewed population growth as a driver of economic prosperity, some rapidly growing populations can actually face economic hardship, poverty, and resource scarcity. On the other hand, countries with declining or stagnant populations have seen improved living standards, greater economic growth, and higher levels of social welfare. How can this be? Doesn't more people generally mean more workers, more consumers, and ultimately more wealth? The demographic economic paradox forces us to reconsider the relationship between population size and economic development. It challenges the idea that a larger population always leads to economic growth, and instead explores how population dynamics, combined with technological innovation, resource allocation, and social policies, can influence long-term prosperity. Let's explore the demographic economic paradox, where the relationship between demographics and economic success isn't always as straightforward as it might seem. The demographic economic paradox has roots in the broader field of population economics, which has studied the connection between population growth and economic development for centuries. Historically, economists and policymakers viewed population growth as a positive indicator of economic health. The classical view held that a larger population meant more workers, which would lead to increased production, greater market demand, and ultimately higher levels of economic output. This perspective was particularly prominent in the Industrial Revolution, when nations experienced a dramatic increase in population alongside rapid industrial growth. However, during the 20th century, particularly after World War II, a new trend emerged in several industrialized nations. As fertility rates began to fall in countries like the United States, Germany, and Japan, their economies continued to grow, and living standards improved. This led economists to question the traditional assumption that more people equals more wealth. Instead, they began to explore how declining birth rates, aging populations, and labor market shifts were influencing economic development. The demographic economic paradox gained attention in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly in the context of developing nations experiencing high rates of population growth without corresponding improvements in living standards. Civil society's challenge. In countries such as India, Brazil, and Nigeria, population growth led to resource depletion, overcrowding, and a lack of social infrastructure, which ultimately undermined potential economic benefits. As these issues grew, researchers began to study the complex relationship between demographics, economic policies, and quality of life. The demographic economic paradox lies in the relationship between population growth and economic development. While many assume that larger populations will lead to more wealth, the paradox shows that, in some cases, a rising population can strain resources, slow down economic progress, and worsen social welfare. This paradox is shaped by multiple factors, including technological advancements, capital accumulation, education, and social policies. 1. Traditional economic assumptions about population growth. A. The classical view, more people, more wealth. Historically, many economists adhered to the view that population growth was directly tied to economic prosperity. Classical economic theory, influenced by thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, emphasized that a larger workforce would increase production and create a larger consumer market. More people meant more labor to produce goods and more consumers to purchase them. This view held that economic growth was a natural byproduct of increased population. B. The role of demographic dividends. In countries with growing populations, particularly developing nations, there is often an initial demographic dividend, a period in which a large proportion of the population is in the working age group and there are fewer dependents. During this time, economic output increases as more people enter the workforce and economic productivity rises. This phase is often seen as a key driver of economic growth in countries experiencing population booms. However, the demographic economic paradox arises when this period of potential economic benefit is not managed properly, and the influx of new workers does not lead to long-term, sustainable growth. Over time, the benefits of population growth can be overshadowed by resource shortages, unemployment, and stagnating wages, especially if education systems, healthcare, and infrastructure cannot keep pace with the growing demand. 2. The challenges of rapid population growth in developing nations. A. Resource depletion and environmental strain. One of the key challenges in countries with rapid population growth is the strain it places on natural resources. Food, water, and energy supplies may be insufficient to meet the needs of a growing population, leading to resource depletion, pollution, and environmental degradation. In such countries, the benefits of a larger labor force are often counterbalanced by the environmental costs of that growth. For example, countries like India, Nigeria, and Brazil have faced significant environmental challenges as their populations have expanded. Urbanization, deforestation, and poor waste management practices have all contributed to rising pollution and unsustainable agricultural practices, undermining the potential economic benefits of population growth. B. Overcrowding and strained infrastructure. Rapid population growth also puts pressure on infrastructure, such as housing, transportation, healthcare, and education systems. In countries with high population growth, there may not be enough resources to build the necessary infrastructure to support the population. This can lead to overcrowding in urban areas, which in turn can increase poverty rates, unemployment, and social unrest. The paradox arises when countries with large populations fail to invest in infrastructure or develop policies that support sustainable growth. As a result, the potential for economic prosperity is diminished by the inability to meet the basic needs of the population, leading to economic stagnation despite a rising population. 3. The role of declining populations in developed nations. A. Aging populations and economic growth. In contrast to rapidly growing populations in some countries, developed nations like Japan, Germany, and Italy face the challenges of aging populations and low birth rates. The population in these countries is shrinking and aging, which leads to a higher proportion of elderly dependents and fewer working-age individuals. This can lead to labour shortages, lower economic growth, and increased social welfare costs, as governments must provide care for an aging population. Despite these challenges, countries with declining populations have often seen higher standards of living, greater social security, and increased health outcomes. In part, this is due to technological innovation, high levels of education, and effective social policies that have enabled these countries to maintain prosperity despite declining birth rates. The paradox lies in the fact that lower population growth can lead to greater wealth and economic stability, even when the working-age population shrinks. B. High productivity and technological advancements. Developed countries with shrinking populations often experience increased productivity and technological advancements as a result of their focus on capital investment, automation, and innovation. In countries like Switzerland, Norway, and South Korea, where birth rates are low and the population is aging, productivity tends to increase as technology and automation replace labor in many industries. This allows these countries to maintain economic prosperity and high standards of living without the need for a growing population. Additionally, the demographic dividend, the boost in economic productivity that comes with a large working-age population, has been realized in many developed nations which have already gone through their periods of high population growth. These countries now benefit from a highly educated and skilled workforce, which drives economic growth even as their populations age and decline. 4. The demographic economic paradox in a global context. A. Global population trends and their impact on growth. The demographic economic paradox extends beyond individual countries to affect global economic dynamics. While global population growth continues in many developing nations, the global population growth rate is actually slowing down. According to United Nations projections, many countries are already experiencing fertility rates below replacement levels, and in the coming decades the world's population will likely age significantly. This will have profound effects on global economic growth, resource distribution, and geopolitical dynamics. Countries with declining populations, such as those in Europe and East Asia, may face challenges related to labor shortages, economic stagnation, and aging infrastructure. However, they may also have opportunities to restructure their economies to rely more on automation, technology, and global trade. B. Migration and economic redistribution. One potential solution to the demographic economic paradox is migration. Migrants often move from high-growth, lower-impact countries to aging, wealthier countries, where they can contribute to the labor force and help support economic growth. Immigration helps to balance the declining populations in many developed countries, providing both labor and consumer demand, while also alleviating some of the social welfare burdens that arise from an aging population. However, migration also brings challenges, such as cultural integration, social tensions, and political debates. These issues can complicate the potential benefits of migration and require careful policy planning to ensure that both the sending and receiving countries benefit from the movement of people. 5. Implications for policy and economic development. A. Policies to manage population growth. Countries facing rapid population growth need to develop policies that ensure sustainable development. This may include investing in education, healthcare, and social infrastructure to manage the growing population. In many cases, improving family planning services, promoting gender equality, and creating economic opportunities for women can help slow down population growth and reduce the strain on resources. B. Strategies for aging populations. On the other hand, countries with aging populations must focus on creating policies that support an aging workforce, such as encouraging lifelong learning, promoting workforce participation among older individuals, and investing in technology and automation to increase productivity. Social welfare systems must also adapt to meet the needs of an aging population, while maintaining fiscal sustainability. 6. Conclusion. A complex and evolving paradox. The demographic economic paradox challenges the conventional wisdom that more people always means more wealth. In reality, the relationship between population growth and economic prosperity is far more complex. Countries with rapid population growth may face significant challenges related to resource allocation, healthcare, and social infrastructure, while countries with aging populations can still maintain economic prosperity through innovation, technology, and labor productivity. This paradox forces us to reconsider the role of demographics in economic development and highlights the need for thoughtful, long-term policies that address the challenges and opportunities presented by changing population dynamics. Downes-Thompson paradox. Imagine you are part of a group that must make a decision, whether to choose a policy, elect a leader, or decide on an important issue. Each person in the group has their own preferences, and they cast their votes or express their preferences based on what they believe is best for the collective. But when all the votes are counted, the decision seems to defy logic. The majority of individuals in the group prefer a different outcome than the one chosen. This is the Downes-Thompson paradox, a dilemma that occurs in voting and collective decision-making processes, where individual preferences lead to a collective decision that is not the preferred choice of the majority. The paradox arises because, in situations where voters are trying to maximize their own utility or well-being, the group decision can be suboptimal for the collective. In essence, the Downes-Thompson paradox challenges the traditional assumption that majority rule leads to optimal outcomes for society. It calls attention to the complex dynamics of voting systems, preference aggregation, and the limitations of democratic decision-making. Let's explore the Downes-Thompson paradox, where individual rationality can lead to group irrationality in decision-making. The Downes-Thompson paradox is named after two prominent economists, Anthony Downes and Paul Stockton, who explored this paradox within the framework of voting theory and social choice. The paradox emerged as a response to earlier theories of majority rule and democratic decision-making, which suggested that a collective decision made by the majority would always reflect the preferences of the group as a whole, leading to optimal outcomes for society. Downes, in particular, is known for his work in public choice theory, which applies economic principles to political decision-making. In his book, An Economic Theory of Democracy, 1957, he argued that voters make decisions based on their self-interest, seeking to maximize their utility. The paradox, as proposed by Downes and later expanded by Thompson, highlights how voting systems can lead to collective choices that do not align with the preferences of the majority, thus undermining the assumption that democracy always produces optimal social outcomes. The Downes-Thompson paradox challenges the assumption that democratic systems are inherently efficient, where voters' choices should naturally lead to the best decisions for the collective. Instead, it raises critical questions about voting systems, preference aggregation, and social welfare, illustrating the potential inefficiencies that arise in decision-making processes that involve multiple individuals with diverse preferences. The Downes-Thompson paradox reveals the complexities of voting systems and collective decision-making, particularly in how individual rationality can lead to suboptimal outcomes for society. This paradox is rooted in the idea that voters act based on self-interest, and as a result, the collective outcome may not reflect the preferences of the majority, leading to what appears to be irrational or inefficient decisions. The paradox is particularly relevant when examining social choice theory and voting behavior. Let's break down the paradox in terms of voting systems, preferences, and aggregate outcomes. 1. Voter preferences and rationality. A. The concept of self-interest. The Downes-Thompson paradox begins with the idea that voters cast their votes based on their own preferences and self-interest. In democratic systems, voters are typically assumed to seek policies or candidates that maximize their utility or the outcome that best serves their interests. For example, in a majority rule election, each voter is likely to support the candidate or policy they believe will best benefit them personally, whether it be in terms of economic prosperity, healthcare, or social policies. The assumption is that voters will act in a rational way to achieve individual benefits through the democratic process. However, the paradox arises because while individual rationality may lead to the most preferred outcomes for each vote, it does not necessarily result in the best or most optimal outcomes for the group as a whole. In other words, the choices made by individuals may not align with the collective good, and the group's decision may be far from ideal. B. Preference aggregation. In a voting system, the individual preferences must be aggregated into a collective decision. Ideally, a voting system should reflect the will of the majority. But aggregation methods, such as plurality voting, ranked choice voting, or border count, can sometimes distort the collective will, leading to suboptimal outcomes. For example, in a plurality voting system, where the candidate with the most votes wins, the majority of voters may end up supporting a candidate that does not represent the overall preference of the electorate. This occurs because the system only accounts for the highest number of votes and ignores the intensity of preferences. As a result, the decision may reflect the preferences of a minority who are able to consolidate their support behind a single candidate, rather than the broader majority. This phenomenon leads to a situation where voters who strategically vote to maximize their own utility may inadvertently create a result that does not reflect the best interests of the group as a whole, reinforcing the Downes-Thompson paradox. 2. The majority rule fallacy. A. The assumption of majority rule. The paradox challenges the assumption that majority rule leads to the optimal outcome for society. According to Arrow's impossibility theorem, a fair and consistent method for aggregating individual preferences into a collective decision does not exist, as any system that respects certain basic principles, like unanimity, non-dictatorship, and transitivity, will necessarily fail in some way. The majority rule is often seen as the cornerstone of democratic systems, where the choice of the majority is expected to align with the collective preferences. In theory, this should lead to an optimal outcome that best satisfies the needs and desires of the society. However, as the Downes-Thompson paradox illustrates, this is not always the case. When each individual voter acts rationally to maximize their own well-being, their choices may not reflect the overall preferences of the group, In a majority voting system, the collective decision is made based on the most popular option, which may not necessarily be the best for everyone. The majority's choice may represent the preferences of a minority of voters, leading to inefficiency and suboptimal outcomes. B. Example of the paradox. Imagine an election where 3 candidates, A, B, and C, are competing for office. In a plurality voting system, if candidate A receives 40% of the vote, candidate B receives 35% and candidate C receives 25%, then A wins, even though the majority, 60%, preferred either B or C over A. This is an example of the majority rule fallacy, where the most popular candidate does not represent the preferences of the majority. The Downs-Thompson paradox arises in these situations, where majority rule does not reflect the optimal outcome for society. The paradox is not just a theoretical flaw in voting systems, it has real-world implications for how policy decisions are made, especially in plurality-based democracies. 3. The influence of strategic voting. A. Voter strategy and manipulation. Another key component of the Downs-Thompson paradox is the role of strategic voting. When voters are aware of the voting system and its potential flaws, they may adjust their choices to maximize their chances of achieving a favorable outcome. This often leads to tactical voting, where voters do not select their most preferred candidate, but rather vote for the candidate they think is most likely to win and is the least undesirable option. For example, if a voter prefers candidate A, but believes that candidate B has a higher chance of winning, they may choose to vote for candidate B even though it is not their first choice. This type of strategic voting can distort the voting process and result in a collective decision that does not reflect the true preferences of the electorate, creating a further disconnect between individual preferences and group outcomes. B. Impact on social welfare. Strategic voting and preference manipulation contribute to the paradox because they introduce a layer of irrationality into the decision-making process. Instead of focusing on the collective good, voters may act based on self-interest or tactical considerations, further undermining the idea that majority rule leads to the optimal outcome. In some cases, voting systems may encourage these types of strategic behaviors. B. Alternatives to majority rule. To address the paradox, some researchers suggest alternative decision-making systems that may better reflect the collective will of the electorate. For example, ranked choice voting, RCV, is a voting system that allows voters to rank candidates by preference, reducing the likelihood that the winning candidate will be a compromised choice that the majority does not prefer. Other proposed alternatives include deliberative democracy, which emphasizes informed discussion and consensus building, and quadratic voting, where individuals allocate votes based on the intensity of their preferences. 5. Conclusion. Rethinking voting systems and decision-making. A. The need for fairer systems. The Downs-Thompson paradox underscores the need to rethink how voting systems and collective decision-making processes are designed. It challenges the idea that majority rule is always the best way to aggregate individual preferences and create policies that benefit society as a whole. The paradox reveals that voting systems can produce irrational results that do not reflect the preferences of the majority, leading to inefficiency and dissatisfaction. Moving toward a better understanding of collective decision-making. By understanding the Downs-Thompson paradox, we can work toward creating more effective and equitable decision-making systems that better reflect the interests of the public and create policies that serve the greater good. It calls for innovation in social choice theory and voting system design, ensuring that democracy truly reflects the will of the people. Estelin paradox. Imagine a world where economic growth and rising income levels are considered the keys to a better quality of life and greater happiness. This is the conventional belief. The wealthier we become, the happier we should be. However, the Estelin paradox challenges this assumption by showing that, despite economic growth over the years, people in many countries have not experienced a corresponding increase in happiness. According to this paradox, income does not appear to be strongly correlated with happiness beyond a certain threshold. In fact, people in wealthier countries are not necessarily any happier than those in countries with lower levels of income. Furthermore, even within a single country, an increase in average income over time does not seem to translate into an increase in subjective well-being. The Estelin paradox forces us to ask, does money really lead to happiness? Or is there something more fundamental at play when it comes to human well-being? Let's explore the Easterlin paradox, where economic growth and personal satisfaction do not always align, and where the pursuit of wealth might not be the ultimate path to happiness. The Easterlin paradox was first proposed by economist Richard Easterlin in the early 1970s. Easterlin's seminal work, published in 1974, challenged the widely held assumption that increased income automatically leads to greater happiness. Through a series of studies, he observed that while individual income levels are positively correlated with subjective well-being, this relationship does not hold on a national scale. Specifically, Easterlin found that while wealthier individuals tend to report higher levels of happiness, countries that experience overall economic growth over time do not show corresponding increases in average happiness. Easterlin's paradox is based on the observation that happiness does not seem to increase indefinitely with rising income. Instead, relative income, how much one earns compared to others, appears to play a more significant role in determining satisfaction. In his studies, Easterlin found that people who experience relative income inequality often report lower levels of happiness, even if their own income is increasing. The paradox thus highlights a key tension between economic growth and human well-being. Economic advancement may not automatically lead to increased happiness, and may in fact have a limited impact once basic material needs are met. Easterlin's theory sparked much debate in the fields of economics, psychology, and sociology, leading researchers to explore the complex relationship between money, happiness, and life satisfaction. The Easterlin paradox challenges the simplistic notion that economic growth leads to greater happiness. While income can certainly enhance happiness up to a certain point, the paradox suggests that once basic material needs are satisfied, further increases in income have a diminishing return on happiness. The paradox has been influential in shaping how we think about well-being, happiness, and economic policy. 1. The relationship between income and happiness. A. Income and happiness. The individual level. At the individual level, there is a clear positive relationship between income and happiness. Research consistently shows that individuals with higher incomes tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction. The more money people have, the less likely they are to worry about basic needs like food, shelter, healthcare, and education. With greater financial security, individuals have the ability to afford luxuries, travel, and experiences that contribute to happiness. However, the relationship between income and happiness is not linear. As income increases, the additional happiness gained from each dollar of income tends to decrease. For example, the difference in happiness between someone making $20,000, 0 cents a year, and someone making $100,000, 0 cents, is likely to be much greater than the difference between someone making $100,000, 0 cents. This diminishing return on happiness as income rises is a central component of the Easterlin paradox. Once basic needs and desires are satisfied, further increases in income do not seem to significantly increase happiness. This finding has profound implications for understanding what truly drives human satisfaction and well-being. B. The role of relative income. While absolute income plays a significant role in an individual's happiness, relative income, how much a person earns in comparison to others, appears to have an even greater impact on subjective well-being. Studies show that people are particularly concerned with their position relative to others when it comes to income. If someone's income rises but the income of others around them rises at the same rate, they may not experience an increase in happiness. This is due to the importance of social comparisons. People tend to measure their well-being not just by their own wealth, but by how they compare to others in their social circles. This is a central aspect of the Easterlin paradox. While economic growth raises the overall income in a society, it can also increase inequality, and, as the gap between the rich and the poor grows, people may feel less satisfied with their lives. The increase in relative inequality can diminish the positive effects of rising national income on average happiness. C. The paradox of national income growth. At the national level, the Easterlin paradox becomes more evident. While countries that experience economic growth see an increase in income and material wealth, this does not always lead to an increase in national happiness. The United States, for example, has seen significant economic growth over the past several decades, but studies show that average happiness levels have remained relatively constant during this period. Despite higher incomes and more consumer goods, life satisfaction has not improved proportionally. Easterlin's research indicates that GDP growth does not automatically translate into improvements in happiness. In fact, there are signs that the relationship between national income and happiness has weakened over time. The increase in consumerism, stress, and work pressures that often accompany economic growth may contribute to the lack of improvement in happiness. Moreover, the gap between the rich and poor in many countries has widened, creating more relative inequality, which has been linked to lower levels of life satisfaction. 2. The importance of non-material factors in happiness. A. Psychological and emotional well-being. The Easterlin Paradox suggests that factors other than income are equally, if not more important, when it comes to happiness. Psychological and emotional well-being, including relationships, mental health, and sense of purpose, are critical determinants of life satisfaction. Strong social connections, family support, and community engagement have been shown to contribute significantly to a person's overall happiness. For example, social support networks provide a sense of belonging and reduce the psychological burden of stress. In societies where people maintain close family relationships and social ties, happiness tends to be higher, even if income levels are not significantly above average. Additionally, a sense of purpose or meaning in life, often associated with work, volunteering, or personal relationships, can provide greater life satisfaction than financial wealth alone. The Easterlin Paradox encourages us to think beyond material wealth and recognize that psychological fulfillment plays a central role in happiness. B. The role of health and life satisfaction. Health is another critical factor in determining happiness. Individuals with chronic illness, physical limitations, or poor mental health tend to report lower levels of satisfaction with life, regardless of their income. Conversely, those with good physical and mental health tend to report higher levels of happiness, even in societies with lower average income. In many cases, countries with public health systems that focus on access to care and prevention of disease may experience higher levels of life satisfaction, even if their average income is lower than that of wealthier nations. This highlights that economic prosperity is not the only determinant of happiness. Social policies and healthcare systems that prioritize well-being can play a significant role in a population's happiness. 3. The paradox of happiness across cultures. A. Cultural differences in happiness. While income plays a role in happiness, the way different cultures define and experience well-being varies significantly. In many societies, community, family ties, and social harmony are considered more important than individual wealth. For instance, Japanese culture places a high value on social harmony and family responsibility, and happiness in Japan is often measured by one's ability to contribute to the welfare of others, rather than personal wealth. In contrast, in more individualistic cultures, such as those in North America and Europe, happiness is more often linked to personal achievement, financial success, and individual autonomy. This cultural difference in how happiness is defined and experienced can influence how economic growth impacts life satisfaction in different countries. In societies where individual wealth is not the ultimate measure of happiness, economic growth may have less impact on overall happiness. B. The limits of economic policy. The Easterlin Paradox has profound implications for public policy. While economic policies that promote growth and prosperity are essential, they should not be viewed as a panacea for increasing happiness. Governments may need to shift their focus from just increasing GDP to improving social well-being, mental health, quality of life, and environmental sustainability. Policies that promote social equality, access to healthcare, education, and community engagement are likely to contribute to greater life satisfaction, even if national income remains stable. 4. Conclusion. Rethinking the relationship between income and happiness. A. Money is not everything. The Easterlin Paradox challenges us to rethink the idea that money and economic growth are the ultimate drivers of happiness. While income can improve living conditions and provide material comforts, it is not the sole determinant of life satisfaction. Non-material factors, such as social connections, emotional well-being, and health, play a more significant role in determining happiness, particularly once basic needs are met. B. The need for balanced well-being. Ultimately, the Easterlin Paradox underscores the importance of holistic well-being. Governments, organizations, and individuals should focus not only on increasing income, but also on fostering a culture of support, community, and mental health. By addressing the psychological, social, and environmental factors that contribute to happiness, we can create a more balanced approach to well-being that goes beyond financial wealth. Edgeworth Paradox. Imagine a world where two competing companies, despite being locked in fierce competition and offering similar products, manage to settle on prices that benefit them both equally. It sounds counterintuitive, right? Competition should drive prices lower, benefiting the consumer and increasing market efficiency. Yet, in the case of the Edgeworth Paradox, we see that in certain situations, competition can increase prices and reduce efficiency. The Edgeworth Paradox occurs in markets with limited competition, where sellers can actually benefit from high prices, despite competing with each other. This paradox challenges the typical assumptions of perfect competition in economic theory, where competition is expected to drive prices down and lead to efficient resource allocation. Instead, in a market where firms have market power and are locked in a pricing dilemma, they can end up in a stalemate where prices remain higher than expected and resources are allocated inefficiently. The Edgeworth Paradox invites us to reconsider the assumptions about how markets work and how competition can sometimes lead to results that contradict the traditional economic expectation of lower prices and increased welfare. Let's explore this paradox, where competition and market forces do not always lead to efficiency. The Edgeworth Paradox was introduced by the British economist Francis Ysidro Edgeworth in 1881 as part of his work in microeconomic theory and market competition. Edgeworth's paradox arose while he was investigating how markets behave under conditions where firms have some degree of market power but still compete with each other. The paradox specifically deals with the effect of competition on pricing in oligopolistic or monopolistic competition markets, where there are few firms competing for market share, but each still has the ability to influence prices. Edgeworth's model demonstrated that in such markets, competition doesn't always lead to lower prices and greater consumer benefit. Instead, under certain conditions, firms may find themselves locked in a situation where they cooperate implicitly, or stagger their price cuts, leading to higher prices and inefficiency in resource allocation. This paradox emerged as a challenge to the classical model of perfect competition, where numerous firms are assumed to drive prices down to the marginal cost of production, benefiting consumers and leading to an economically efficient allocation of resources. The Edgeworth Paradox remains an important concept in the study of imperfect competition, market structure, and game theory, as it underscores the limitations of traditional economic models that assume perfect competition as a guiding principle for understanding market behavior. The paradox shows that real-world markets with fewer competitors can behave in ways that contradict standard economic expectations. The Edgeworth Paradox highlights an anomaly in the classic theory of market competition. While standard economic theory posits that competition drives prices down to the marginal cost of production, leading to an efficient allocation of resources, the Edgeworth Paradox suggests that under certain conditions, competition in a market with limited firms, oligopolies, can lead to higher prices and reduced efficiency. This paradox draws attention to the complexities of real-world markets, which often do not follow the assumptions of perfect competition. 1. Theoretical background: perfect competition versus oligopoly. A. Perfect competition assumptions. The classical economic model of perfect competition assumes that there are many firms in a market, each producing identical products. Under these conditions, firms are price takers, meaning they cannot influence the price of the product they sell. The model also assumes that there are no barriers to entry or exit, so new firms can enter the market freely if there are profit opportunities. In a perfectly competitive market, the forces of supply and demand drive the price down to the marginal cost of production, meaning firms make zero economic profit in the long run. Consumers benefit from low prices and optimal resource allocation. Perfect competition leads to the most efficient distribution of goods and services because the price reflects the true cost of production, and there is no economic waste. B. Oligopoly and imperfect competition. The Edgeworth Paradox arises in a market structure known as an oligopoly, where there are only a few firms competing against each other. In this market structure, firms have some degree of market power, meaning they can influence the price of their product. Unlike in perfect competition, where prices are set by the market, Firms in an oligopoly can set prices and strategize to maximize their profits. Oligopolistic firms are often aware of each other's actions and decisions, which leads to strategic behavior. These firms can either compete with each other, driving prices down, or engage in more cooperative behavior, where they stagger their price changes or implicitly cooperate to keep prices higher. The Edgeworth paradox emerges from this situation where firms, despite competing, find it in their best interest to keep prices high rather than drive them down through intense competition. 2. Price rigidity and the Edgeworth box. The Edgeworth box, a model of price competition. The Edgeworth box is a graphical tool used to illustrate how firms with some degree of market power might behave in an oligopoly. The box shows the trade-offs between two competing firms, Firm A and Firm B, in terms of price and quantity. In a typical perfect competition scenario, the interaction between supply and demand would lead to a single equilibrium price where both firms produce at the lowest possible cost. However, in an oligopoly or imperfectly competitive market, the firms may engage in price rigidity, where they avoid changing prices aggressively because they fear retaliation from their competitors. This results in a situation where, even though there is competition, prices remain sticky and do not adjust downward in the way that traditional economic models would predict. B. The role of price leadership in some oligopolistic markets. One firm might act as a price leader, setting the price at a level that other firms follow. This behavior can reduce the intensity of price competition and prevent prices from falling to the level of marginal cost. The Edgeworth paradox highlights how this price leadership can lead to higher than expected prices even in the presence of competition. Instead of competing by lowering prices, firms in an oligopoly may focus on differentiating their products, advertising, or engaging in non-price competition. The result is that prices remain above the level of marginal cost, which is inefficient from an economic standpoint. 3. The consequences of the Edgeworth paradox. Inefficient resource allocation. One of the key issues raised by the Edgeworth paradox is the concept of inefficient resource allocation. In markets with perfect competition, resources are allocated in such a way that the price reflects the true cost of production, leading to an optimal distribution of goods and services. However, in oligopolistic markets, where firms keep prices above marginal cost, there is a waste of resources. The lack of price competition in these markets results in consumers paying higher prices than they would in a perfectly competitive market. The firms, instead of competing to lower prices, may engage in activities like advertising or differentiation that do not contribute to real economic value but rather lead to higher costs for consumers. This results in a deadweight loss, where some of the potential economic welfare is lost due to higher prices and reduced quantities produced. B. Consumer welfare and market efficiency. The Edgeworth paradox challenges the idea that competition always benefits consumers. In some cases, the absence of perfect competition results in prices that are too high, leading to a reduction in consumer surplus. While competition in an oligopoly can keep prices lower than they would be under a monopoly, it does not necessarily drive prices down to the socially optimal level that would occur in a perfectly competitive market. Instead, firms in oligopolistic markets may engage in price-fixing behavior or find ways to maintain price stability through price leadership, collusion, or strategic pricing. These tactics keep prices higher than they would be in a perfectly competitive market and result in inefficiencies. 4. Policy implications and solutions to the Edgeworth paradox. A. Antitrust regulation. The Edgeworth paradox has important implications for antitrust policy. In markets where competition does not lead to lower prices or increased efficiency, government intervention may be necessary to promote a more competitive environment. Antitrust laws aim to prevent price fixing, collusion, and monopolistic behavior, ensuring that firms do not have the ability to manipulate prices to the detriment of consumers. In oligopolistic markets, regulators may focus on increasing market transparency, reducing barriers to entry, and promoting competition through the breakup of monopolies or the encouragement of new firms to enter the market. The goal is to ensure that competition leads to lower prices, better quality products, and more efficient resource allocation. B. Game theory and collusion. The Edgeworth paradox also highlights the importance of game theory in understanding how firms behave in oligopolistic markets. Game theory suggests that firms may engage in strategic behavior to maximize their profits, even if that behavior leads to higher prices and reduced consumer welfare. Understanding these dynamics can help regulators predict how firms will interact and design policies that foster healthy competition while discouraging anti-competitive practices. 5. Conclusion. Rethinking market competition. A. The limits of perfect competition. Models. The Edgeworth paradox reminds us that real-world markets do not always conform to the assumptions of perfect competition. While perfect competition assumes that competition drives prices down to the marginal cost of production, the reality in many markets is more complex. In oligopolistic markets, firms may find it in their best interest to maintain price stability, even at the cost of inefficiency. The paradox forces us to reconsider the role of competition in ensuring market efficiency. It shows that in some cases, price competition may not result in the best outcomes for consumers, and that non-price competition, product differentiation, and market power can lead to higher prices and reduced welfare. Regulation and policy interventions are needed to ensure that markets operate in a way that benefits consumers and promotes economic efficiency. The European paradox, Europe, often regarded as the cradle of social welfare systems, presents an intriguing paradox. While many European countries invest heavily in social safety nets, universal healthcare, and generous labour protections, they also face significant economic challenges in maintaining global competitiveness. How can countries with such high levels of government spending and a focus on social equality continue to compete in a globalized market? The European paradox questions this balance between social welfare and economic growth. On one hand, countries like France, Germany, and the Nordic states are known for their strong social policies, including universal healthcare, free education, and substantial retirement benefits. On the other hand, these same nations struggle with high taxes, stagnant growth, and increased competition from emerging markets. The paradox arises because, while these policies provide a high quality of life, they also impose economic constraints that might hinder entrepreneurship, innovation, and job creation. How can Europe maintain this balance and continue to thrive both socially and economically? The European paradox challenges the conventional wisdom that economic prosperity and social welfare are mutually exclusive, offering an opportunity to rethink the relationship between welfare states and economic competitiveness. The European paradox emerged as a central theme in political and economic discussions during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, particularly as Europe grappled with the challenges of globalization and economic integration. The paradox refers to the tension between Europe's traditional model of social welfare with universal healthcare, generous labor protections, and a strong social safety net, and the demands of the global economy, which favors competition, innovation, and market-driven growth. The term gained prominence in the 1990s and early 2000s as the European Union, EU, worked to harmonise economic policies across member states and integrate Eastern European countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall. During this time, European economies were growing at a slower rate compared to rapidly industrialising nations such as China, India, and Brazil. Critics of the European social model argued that high taxes, restrictive labour laws, and expansive welfare programmes were stifling economic growth and innovation. At the same time, proponents of the European system pointed to the high quality of life, low poverty rates, and social stability achieved through strong social policies. The paradox deepened as Europe sought to maintain a competitive edge in the global market while preserving its welfare state model. The tension between social responsibility and economic competitiveness remains one of the most debated issues in European politics, with some advocating for reform and others defending the European model as a necessary counterbalance to capitalism. The European paradox lies in the difficulty of reconciling the strong social safety nets and welfare programs that many European countries offer with the demands of economic growth, global competitiveness, and entrepreneurship. At first glance, it seems as though countries that prioritize social equality and welfare may not be able to compete effectively on the global stage. However, a closer look reveals that the relationship between welfare and economic competitiveness is much more nuanced. Europe is known for its strong social welfare systems, which provide universal access to healthcare, education, and retirement benefits. Countries like Sweden, Denmark and Finland offer comprehensive social services which are funded through high taxes and government spending. These countries have made a deliberate choice to prioritize social security and equality, ensuring that their citizens have access to a high standard of living regardless of their socioeconomic status. The European social model is rooted in the idea that economic growth should not come at the expense of social justice. Governments across Europe have embraced the concept of the welfare state, where the state assumes responsibility for ensuring that basic needs, such as healthcare, education, and employment, are met for all citizens. This system aims to reduce inequality, improve health outcomes, and provide a safety net for the most vulnerable populations. However, the European social contract also comes with significant economic challenges. High taxes are necessary to fund these programs, and many Europeans face high levels of taxation on their income, which can create economic inefficiencies and limit disposable income. Furthermore, the strong emphasis on labor protections, job security, and regulated markets can make it difficult for businesses to adapt to global competition and market changes. The need to fund comprehensive social programs has resulted in high taxes across many European nations, especially in Scandinavia. Taxes on income, consumption and wealth are relatively high, with the revenue supporting public services such as healthcare, education and social security. While these policies help ensure that citizens enjoy a high quality of life, they also place a strain on economic growth. High taxes can discourage investment, reduce incentives for entrepreneurship, and result in lower disposable income for individuals. For businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, the cost of compliance with labor laws and tax regulations can be a burden, especially when competing against lower-cost producers in emerging markets. Furthermore, the high levels of government spending required to maintain the welfare state can lead to budget deficits and growing national debt, which presents a challenge for European economies, especially in the context of global economic downturns and financial crises. The global economy has transformed dramatically over the past few decades, with the rise of emerging markets and technological advancements changing the way goods, services, and labor are exchanged. In this new global landscape, countries with open economies and competitive industries are better positioned to thrive, while those with high levels of protectionism or bureaucratic inefficiencies may struggle to maintain their edge. Globalization has led to an increase in trade and foreign investment, creating opportunities for countries that are able to compete on the world stage. However, for European nations, the challenge lies in balancing their social welfare systems with the demands of global competitiveness. High taxes and stringent labor regulations can make it difficult for European businesses to compete with companies from countries with lower labor costs, such as China or India. At the same time, the rapid pace of technological innovation has created a new set of challenges for European economies. In particular, the rise of digital technologies, automation, and artificial intelligence has disrupted traditional industries and created new opportunities for growth. To stay competitive, European nations must invest heavily in research and development, education, and technology infrastructure, all of which require significant financial resources. Entrepreneurship and innovation are key drivers of economic growth, and countries that foster startup ecosystems and business-friendly environments tend to thrive in the global market. In contrast, countries with restrictive labor laws, high taxes, and complex regulatory systems may struggle to attract investment and entrepreneurs. In Europe, the startup culture has been slower to develop compared to places like Silicon Valley, due in part to the risk-averse culture that comes with social welfare systems. While countries like Germany, France, and the UK have seen an increase in entrepreneurial activity, the European Union as a whole still lags behind other regions in terms of venture capital and new business creation. High levels of government regulation and taxation can be barriers to the development of an entrepreneurial spirit, which is essential for fostering innovation and ensuring economic competitiveness. One of the key barriers to economic competitiveness in Europe is the level of bureaucracy and regulation. While European countries are known for their strong labor protections and environmental standards, these regulations can make it difficult for businesses to be flexible and adapt to changing market conditions. Labour market rigidities, such as high minimum wages and collective bargaining agreements, can make it harder for companies to hire and fire workers based on market needs. In addition, EU regulations can create challenges for businesses that wish to operate across borders. While the single market has promoted trade and economic integration, The complexity of the EU regulatory framework can sometimes be a hindrance to business growth. These regulatory challenges are particularly difficult for small businesses and startups, which often lack the resources to navigate the legal complexities of doing business across multiple countries. The European paradox revolves around the tension between the welfare state and the need for economic growth. On the one hand, the welfare state provides social safety nets that ensure citizens have access to essential services such as healthcare, education, and retirement benefits, regardless of their economic status. On the other hand, these social policies often require high taxes and government spending, which can stifle economic growth and innovation. The challenge for European countries is finding a balance between maintaining their social welfare systems and remaining competitive in a globalized economy. In some cases, countries may have to reform their welfare policies, making them more sustainable and targeted to ensure that they do not undermine economic growth. Some European countries, like Denmark and Sweden, have successfully integrated a flexible labour market with their strong welfare systems, proving that it is possible to strike a balance between social protection and economic competitiveness. To maintain a competitive edge while preserving the welfare state, European countries must focus on innovation and technological advancement. Investments in research and development, education and technology are essential for ensuring that the European economy remains competitive in the face of global challenges. Furthermore, countries must focus on fostering entrepreneurship, startup ecosystems, and venture capital to stimulate economic growth and job creation. The European paradox highlights the importance of smart policy making, finding ways to reduce inefficiencies in the welfare system while investing in the sectors that drive innovation and economic growth. This requires reforming traditional social programs to make them more sustainable, while also encouraging the development of new technologies and industries that can create long-term economic prosperity. Gibson's paradox. In economic theory, interest rates and inflation are typically seen as linked in a straightforward way. As inflation rises, interest rates should also rise to compensate for the loss in purchasing power. But what if this conventional wisdom doesn't hold true? This is the essence of Gibson's paradox, a curious phenomenon discovered by economist Arthur Gibson in the early 20th century, which found an inverse relationship between interest rates and inflation over long periods of time. Despite the expectation that higher inflation should lead to higher interest rates, Gibson observed that interest rates and inflation had actually moved in opposite directions for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. How can this be? If inflation increases, why don't interest rates adjust upwards as expected? The Gibson's paradox forces us to question the simplified models of economic theory, suggesting that the relationship between inflation and interest rates is more complicated than we might assume. Let's explore Gibson's paradox, where interest rates, inflation, and economic theory collide in a puzzling and counterintuitive way. The Gibson's paradox was named after Arthur Gibson, a British economist who first observed this paradox in the early 20th century. Gibson discovered that, over a long-term historical view, interest rates and inflation in the Western economies did not follow the expected direct correlation. According to standard economic theory, as inflation rises, central banks should raise interest rates to control inflation and stabilize the economy. The rationale behind this is simple. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive and savings more attractive, thus cooling demand and helping to curb inflation. However, Gibson found that between the 19th and early 20th centuries, interest rates and inflation often moved in opposite directions. In periods of rising inflation, interest rates tended to fall, and in periods of low inflation, interest rates tended to rise. This went against the conventional economic wisdom of the time and posed a challenge to the classical theories of interest rate behavior. Gibson's work was largely overlooked at first, but it gained attention during the Great Depression and subsequent periods of economic turmoil, when central banks struggled to manage inflation and interest rates effectively. Paradox continues to be an important point of study in macroeconomics and monetary policy, particularly when central banks are dealing with long-term trends and economic crises. The Gibson's paradox remains an important puzzle for economists as they try to understand the complex relationship between interest rates, inflation, and economic performance, particularly in times of economic instability. The Gibson's paradox represents a counterintuitive relationship between interest rates and inflation, which has challenged traditional economic thinking. Typically, economic theory suggests that an increase in inflation should lead to an increase in interest rates to compensate for the loss in purchasing power. However, Gibson observed that the relationship between these two variables was not as straightforward as expected. In fact, historical data suggested that for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, interest rates and inflation often moved in opposite directions. This paradox has intrigued economists for decades, raising questions about the assumptions of classical economic models and the underlying forces that govern interest rate behavior. According to classical economic theory, interest rates are supposed to reflect the cost of borrowing and the time value of money. When inflation rises, the purchasing power of money declines, making it more expensive to borrow and lending less attractive to investors. Therefore, central banks typically raise interest rates to counteract inflation by making borrowing more expensive and saving more attractive. The Fisher equation is often used to express the relationship between nominal interest rates, real interest rate, and inflation. Nominal interest rate equals real interest rate plus inflation rate. According to this model, when inflation increases, nominal interest rates should also rise to keep the real interest rate stable. In practice, however, the relationship between inflation and interest rates is not always as simple. Gibson's paradox pointed out that there were times in history when inflation increased, but interest rates actually fell. Conversely, in periods of low inflation, interest rates rose. This suggested that other factors, beyond just inflation, were influencing interest rate behavior. For example, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, some periods of high inflation were accompanied by relatively low interest rates, contrary to the prediction of the Fisher equation. This phenomenon persisted through various economic cycles, including gold standard periods, recessions, and booms. The behavior of interest rates and inflation during these periods became a major area of interest for economists. One possible explanation for the Gibson's paradox lies in the role of central banks and their monetary policies. Central banks, particularly after the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, have used monetary policy to manage inflation and interest rates. By manipulating the money supply and using tools like open market operations, reserve requirements, and discount rates, central banks aim to control inflation and stabilize the economy. In periods of inflationary pressure, central banks may choose not to raise interest rates immediately, particularly if the inflation is perceived as temporary or driven by factors outside of their control, such as rising commodity prices or supply chain disruptions. In such cases, the central bank may allow inflation to rise while keeping interest rates low to encourage investment and economic growth. On the other hand, during times of deflation or economic stagnation, central banks may lower interest rates to stimulate borrowing and investment. This helps to increase demand and prevent further economic decline. The Gibson's paradox suggests that these monetary policy decisions, particularly when aimed at stimulating economic recovery, can cause interest rates to behave counterintuitively relative to inflation. The Phillips curve offers another lens through which to view the Gibson's paradox. The Phillips curve suggests an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. That is, when unemployment is low, inflation tends to rise, and when unemployment is high, inflation tends to fall. This relationship implies that policymakers might face trade-offs between managing inflation and promoting employment. In a scenario where inflation is high but unemployment is low, central banks might keep interest rates low to avoid stifling employment growth, even though higher inflation would normally signal a need for higher interest rates. The Gibson's paradox suggests that these complex trade-offs between inflation, unemployment, and interest rates may explain why the expected positive correlation between inflation and interest rates is not always observed. Gibson's paradox was most apparent during the 19th century, a period characterized by gold standards, limited central bank intervention, and relatively low levels of government spending. During this period, the rate of inflation was often driven by fluctuations in the supply of gold, which influenced the money supply. Despite periods of rising inflation, interest rates remained relatively low, contradicting the expected direct relationship. In times of high inflation, caused by changes in the global supply of gold or other external factors, interest rates in countries with gold-backed currencies did not necessarily rise. Instead, they remained low or even declined, particularly in economies that were highly dependent on international trade and commodity markets. The Great Depression of the 1930s and the post-war period saw a divergence between inflation and interest rates that further perplexed economists. During the Great Depression, inflation was extremely low, but interest rates remained high. as central banks attempted to maintain the value of their currencies and stimulate investment. Conversely, after World War II, many countries experienced high levels of inflation, but still maintained relatively low interest rates to support post-war economic recovery. In these periods, the monetary policies of central banks and the global economic conditions played a significant role in determining interest rates, rather than just the immediate effects of inflation. The paradox became evident as central banks made decisions to balance economic growth and inflation control, leading to interest rates that did not respond to inflation in the typical manner. One potential explanation for the Gibson's paradox is the role of expectations in setting both interest rates and inflation. Inflation expectations can influence the behavior of both consumers and investors, potentially leading to lower interest rates, even in times of rising inflation, if there is a high level of confidence in the economy's long-term stability. Central banks often adjust interest rates in response to these expectations, rather than directly in response to the current level of inflation. Another possible explanation is the role of external shocks, such as wars, technological breakthroughs, or changes in commodity prices, that influence inflation and interest rates independently of traditional economic factors. For example, oil price shocks or significant shifts in the global supply chain could cause inflation to rise without triggering the typical interest rate hikes. The Gibson's paradox may also be explained by the interaction between fiscal policy, government spending and taxation, and monetary policy, central bank control of interest rates. In times of crisis, governments may choose to spend heavily to stimulate the economy, while central banks may keep interest rates low to encourage investment. This coordinated approach can create a situation where inflation rises without the expected increase in interest rates. The Gibson's paradox challenges conventional economic models that predict a direct relationship between inflation and interest rates. It suggests that other factors, such as monetary policy, government spending, and global economic conditions, play a more complex role in determining interest rate behavior. This paradox encourages economists to consider a broader set of variables when studying the dynamics between inflation and interest rates. The paradox also has implications for the role of central banks in monetary policy. The ability of central banks to manage inflation without necessarily raising interest rates may be seen as an advantage, as it provides more flexibility to stimulate the economy while still maintaining price stability. However, it also raises important questions about the effectiveness and long-term sustainability of such policies. It can paradox. Imagine a world where the price of a staple food, let's say bread, increases, and instead of reducing consumption, people actually buy more of it. This seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Typically, when the price of something goes up, demand tends to fall, but in certain poverty-stricken or low-income populations, an increase in the price of a basic necessity can actually lead to increased demand. This is the essence of the Giffen paradox, a fascinating economic anomaly where the law of demand, which states that as prices rise, demand falls, seems to break down under specific conditions. How can this happen? The Giffen paradox occurs in situations where inferior goods, which make up a substantial portion of the consumer's budget, are purchased more when their prices increase. This paradox challenges traditional economic theories and forces us to reconsider the dynamics of poverty, market behavior, and consumer choices. Let's explore the Giffen paradox, where economics defies expectations and where poverty and market behavior interact in unexpected ways. The Giffen paradox is named after the Scottish economist Sir Robert Giffen, who observed the phenomenon in the 19th century. Giffen was studying the consumption habits of people living in poverty in Ireland and Scotland. He noted that during a period of famine, the price of bread and rice increased, yet the demand for these goods didn't decrease as expected. Instead, people actually bought more bread and rice, even though these goods were becoming more expensive. This behavior seemed to defy the typical economic rule that as prices rise, demand falls. Giffen's observations were controversial at the time, and the paradox was largely theoretical until it was demonstrated more concretely in the 20th century through empirical studies and experiments. The paradox suggests that in situations of extreme poverty, where basic necessities account for a large proportion of the consumer's budget, people may buy more of a good as its price rises, because they cannot afford to buy more expensive alternatives. This is known as the income effect, which outweighs the substitution effect, the typical response of buying less of a more expensive good. Despite being considered rare and counterintuitive, The Giffen paradox has provided important insights into the complexities of consumer behavior, poverty, and market demand, especially in situations where traditional economic models fail to predict real-world outcomes. The paradox continues to be a point of discussion and debate among economists and policymakers who are concerned with poverty alleviation and market dynamics. The Giffen paradox is a counterintuitive phenomenon in economics where demand for a good increases when its price increases. This paradox occurs under very specific conditions, typically in situations where a good is considered an inferior good, one that people buy more of as their income falls, typically due to lack of better alternatives. To understand the Giffen paradox, we need to explore demand theory, income effects, substitution effects, and the conditions under which this paradox might occur. The law of demand is one of the core principles of microeconomics. It asserts that as the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded for that good will generally decrease, all other factors being equal. This relationship is typically inverse. Higher prices lead to lower demand and lower prices lead to higher demand. The law of demand is one of the most established and widely accepted principles in economics, forming the basis of much of market theory. However, the Giffen paradox directly challenges this principle by illustrating an exception to the law. It suggests that in certain situations, increases in price can actually lead to increased demand, rather than a decrease. Giffen goods are the central focus of the Giffen paradox. These are inferior goods, products for which demand increases as consumer incomes fall. They typically occupy a significant portion of the budget of low-income consumers. The most commonly cited examples of Giffen goods are bread and rice, especially in countries or regions experiencing economic hardship or famine. For a good to be classified as a Giffen good, it must satisfy certain conditions. First, the good must be an inferior good, meaning that as the consumer's income decreases, they increase consumption of this good because it is cheaper than alternatives. Second, the price increase must be large enough to outweigh the substitution effect, which would normally drive demand down and result in an income effect that causes consumers to buy more of the good. The Giffen paradox is most likely to occur in scenarios where consumers have limited access to more expensive alternatives and where basic staples like bread, rice, and potatoes make up a significant portion of their caloric intake. When the price of these goods increases, consumers may be forced to spend more on the cheaper staple because they can no longer afford to purchase more expensive alternatives, such as meat or vegetables. As a result, they buy more of the bread or rice to meet their basic energy needs, even though the price has increased. The income effect refers to the change in demand for a good resulting from a change in real income or purchasing power due to a price change. When the price of a good increases, consumers have less real income and are able to purchase fewer goods overall. This would usually result in a reduction in demand for the higher price good, as consumers substitute it for a cheaper option. However, in the case of Giffen goods, the income effect outweighs the substitution effect. When the price of an essential item, like bread or rice, increases, consumers may be unable to afford to purchase more expensive goods, like meat or vegetables, because they now have less disposable income. As a result, they end up buying more of the inferior good, even though its price has risen, because it is the only affordable option that still meets their caloric needs. For example, in a situation where a famine has driven up the price of bread, consumers who rely on bread as their primary source of sustenance may find that they can no longer afford meat, vegetables, or even more nutritious foods. To maintain their basic caloric intake, they may purchase more bread to make up for the loss of these more expensive food items. The substitution effect occurs when the price of a good rises, prompting consumers to seek out cheaper alternatives. Normally, when the price of a good increases, people substitute it with a less expensive alternative that provides similar benefits. For instance, if the price of rice rises significantly, consumers may switch to potatoes or pasta, foods that are cheaper but still provide substantial calories. However, in the case of Giffen goods, the substitution effect is either weak or overridden by the income effect. The key difference between Giffen goods and other inferior goods is that Giffen goods have no viable substitutes in the market. When the price of bread or rice increases, there may be no affordable alternatives, and the only way to maintain caloric intake is to purchase more of the same good, despite its higher price. This leads to an increase in demand for the good, even though the price has risen. The Giffen paradox is most likely to occur in poverty-stricken areas where people's basic needs, such as food security, are met primarily through the consumption of low-cost staples. When the prices of these staples rise, the impact on real income is significant, and the consumer has no choice but to purchase more of the staple to meet their energy needs. In wealthier societies, the income effect typically results in less demand for high-calorie, low-nutrient foods when prices rise, because consumers can substitute them for healthier options. In contrast, low-income individuals may not have access to alternatives and may be forced to increase consumption of the higher-priced staple. For a good to qualify as a Giffen good, it must have few or no substitutes. If there is a cheaper substitute available, then the substitution effect will dominate, and the demand for the more expensive good will fall. However, in the case of Giffen goods, the lack of affordable substitutes means that the income effect leads consumers to buy more of the same good even as its price increases. For the Giffen paradox to apply, the good in question must account for a significant portion of the consumer's budget. When a good, such as bread or rice, constitutes a large percentage of a family's food expenditure, the price increase of that good has a large impact on their overall purchasing power. This can lead to a situation where, in order to maintain basic caloric intake, the consumer buys more of the now more expensive staple, even though they can no longer afford to purchase higher quality alternatives. One of the earliest and most well-known examples of the Giffen paradox is the Irish famine in the mid-19th century. During this period, the price of potatoes increased dramatically due to crop failures. In response, Irish peasants, who relied on potatoes as their primary source of sustenance, increased their consumption of potatoes despite the rising prices. This paradoxical behavior, buying more of a food even as its price increased, was a key feature of the famine's economic impact. In modern developing countries, the Giffen paradox can sometimes be observed in markets where basic staples like rice, corn, or wheat make up a large portion of the population's diet. For example, during times of inflation or economic instability, these basic staples may see price increases, leading people in low-income populations to purchase more of the staple, as they cannot afford the more expensive alternatives like meat or vegetables. Although the Giffen paradox is an interesting anomaly, it is extremely rare in practice. Most goods do not exhibit the characteristics necessary to qualify as Giffen goods. In many cases, substitutes are available, and consumers will tend to reduce demand for a good when its price rises. The Giffen paradox is considered a theoretical rather than a common occurrence in most markets. While the Giffen paradox has been demonstrated in some historical and experimental settings, there is limited empirical evidence of Giffen goods in modern economies. Some economists argue that the phenomenon is theoretical and that it does not occur often in real-world markets. However, researchers continue to study its potential applications in developing economies and areas of extreme poverty. Grossman-Stiglitz paradox. Imagine a world where perfect information exists for everyone and every market participant has access to the same data. This would mean no one could outperform others through superior knowledge, and prices would reflect true value in a perfect market. However, this ideal scenario is challenged by the Grossman-Stiglitz paradox. In a perfectly efficient market, there would be no incentive for individuals to gather information. Yet information is crucial for price discovery and ensuring market efficiency. If all information were freely available, why would anyone spend time and resources gathering it? The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox shows that market efficiency and information availability cannot coexist perfectly in real-world scenarios. If information is free and everyone has it, there's no need for traders to perform the costly task of gathering and analyzing information. Without these efforts, prices may not fully reflect the underlying market value, undermining the concept of an efficient market. In other words, the paradox lies in the fact that efficiency and the existence of information asymmetries are mutually dependent. Information must remain costly and scarce for markets to function effectively. Let's explore the Grossman-Stiglitz paradox, where market efficiency and the cost of information collide in a complex dynamic that challenges our understanding of financial markets. The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox was introduced by economists Sanford Grossman and Joseph Stiglitz in 1980 as a critique of the efficient market hypothesis, EMH, a central theory in financial economics. The EMH posits that financial markets are informationally efficient, meaning that all available information is already reflected in asset prices, and no one can consistently outperform the market by using information that is not already incorporated into prices. According to this hypothesis, if markets are perfectly efficient, traders should not be able to earn excess returns by using private or proprietary information. Grossman and Stiglitz's seminal paper demonstrated that perfect market efficiency cannot exist without undermining the incentives for individuals to gather information. The paradox they posed argues that if everyone has access to all information, there would be no differentiated knowledge between traders, meaning that there would be no reason to trade or invest. If there is no incentive to gather information because it is freely available, then price discovery cannot occur, and the market would not reflect true values. Information costs thus play a fundamental role in maintaining market efficiency. The paradox presented by Grossman and Stiglitz challenges the idea that markets can be perfectly efficient in practice. It suggests that information asymmetries and the cost of acquiring knowledge are necessary for the functioning of financial markets. Their work has had profound implications in economics and finance, influencing how we think about market efficiency, pricing mechanisms, and trading strategies in the real world. The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox presents a fundamental dilemma in financial economics. If markets are perfectly efficient, then there would be no incentive to acquire information. Yet acquiring information is essential for price discovery and market efficiency. This paradox challenges the core of the efficient market hypothesis, EMH, which suggests that all available information is already reflected in asset prices and that no one can consistently outperform the market. By showing that perfect market efficiency would actually prevent the discovery of true market prices, Grossman and Stiglitz force us to reconsider how information operates in financial markets. The efficient market hypothesis, EMH, introduced by economist Eugene Fama in the 1960s, suggests that financial markets are efficient, meaning that asset prices always reflect all available information. According to the EMH, prices adjust rapidly to new information, making it impossible to consistently beat the market through research or insider knowledge. The three forms of the EMH are weak form efficiency, prices reflect all historical price data, semi-strong form efficiency, prices reflect all information, and strong form efficiency. Prices reflect all information, including private or insider knowledge. The idea is that traders and investors cannot consistently profit from market inefficiencies because any new information that could lead to a profitable trade is already factored into the prices. Under this framework, any effort to outperform the market would be futile because the market is inherently efficient at pricing assets. The EMH implies that there is no information advantage in financial markets. If the market is efficient, everyone has equal access to all the information, and prices should always be an accurate reflection of the underlying value of assets. Investors cannot outperform the market by simply gathering more information or using sophisticated analysis, because the market already accounts for that information in the price of assets. As a result, the EMH encourages passive investing, such as investing in index funds, where investors don't attempt to pick individual stocks but rather invest in a broad market portfolio. According to the EMH, the best way to achieve returns is simply to track the market rather than attempt to outperform it. The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox directly challenges the notion of a perfectly efficient market. Grossman and Stiglitz argued that if markets were perfectly efficient, there would be no incentive for investors to gather information because everyone would already know everything and there would be no opportunities for profit. However, this creates a paradox. If there's no incentive to gather information, how can markets remain efficient? Their argument suggests that information is costly to obtain, and this cost provides the incentive for individuals or firms to engage in research and information gathering. If information were freely available, there would be no reason for individuals to spend resources gathering it, and therefore price discovery would break down. Prices wouldn't fully reflect available information and market efficiency would be undermined. The paradox forces us to acknowledge that information costs are necessary for markets to operate effectively. Without the ability to gather and process information, the market cannot accurately reflect true values. If information were free and instantly accessible, there would be no reason for anyone to pay for the information or invest in gathering it, and prices would no longer be accurate. In the real world, investors and traders spend time and money to gather information, analyze it, and make informed decisions. The cost of acquiring information is the reason why some traders or firms can outperform the market. This cost creates an information asymmetry. where those with better access to information can make informed decisions that lead to profits. However, in a world where all information is free and instantaneously accessible, the motivation for traders to gather information and participate in the market would disappear. Without the effort and cost of acquiring information, prices would become less reflective of the underlying value of assets. In other words, information asymmetry, the differences in knowledge between market participants, is necessary for efficient price discovery. Price discovery is the process by which the price of an asset is determined in a market, influenced by all available information. In an efficient market, prices should reflect all publicly available information, including economic data, company performance, geopolitical factors, and other relevant news. For prices to accurately reflect the true value of an asset, there needs to be an ongoing process of information gathering by investors, analysts, and traders. In the Grossman-Stiglitz paradox, price discovery can only occur if some market participants are willing to invest in gathering information. If all participants were equally informed, there would be no reason to buy or sell an asset, and prices would become stagnant. Active traders who engage in research and information processing play an essential role in ensuring that the market adjusts to new data and reflects the true value of assets. In practice, markets are rarely perfectly efficient and information asymmetries are common. Insider trading, market manipulation, and analyst recommendations are all examples of how information asymmetry exists in financial markets. The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox helps explain why these inefficiencies persist. If everyone were to have perfect information, there would be no incentive for traders to invest in market research or analysis. Price discovery requires information costs, and without these costs, markets would struggle to function effectively. The paradox also suggests that market efficiency is inherently linked to imperfect information. Traders and investors play an essential role in gathering and analyzing information, even if the information is available to the public. Their work ensures that prices reflect the best available data, and their efforts create the market movements that reflect changes in value and opportunity. The Grossman-Stiglitz paradox forces us to reconsider the concept of market efficiency. In practice, markets cannot be perfectly efficient, because information is not freely available to everyone, and there are inherent costs in acquiring and processing information. Rather than pursuing the idea of perfect efficiency, we must recognize that information asymmetries play a necessary role in maintaining market efficiency. Understanding the Grossman-Stiglitz paradox also has important implications for financial regulations and market practices. For example, insider trading laws exist to ensure that those with access to non-public information do not have an unfair advantage in the market. Similarly, regulations on research practices and disclosure requirements aim to level the playing field and ensure that information is distributed more fairly across market participants. Ultimately, the Grossman-Stiglitz paradox highlights the vital role of information in the functioning of financial markets. Information costs are what drive innovation, investment, and efficient pricing. As such, the paradox underscores that market participants must be able to access and process information at a reasonable cost in order to ensure that markets remain functional and that asset prices reflect the underlying economic reality. Icarus paradox. Imagine someone who has worked tirelessly, reaching the peak of their ambitions. Their success is undeniable, their confidence sky high, and they are finally poised to achieve something great, only to fall short, or worse, to crash in the process. This is the essence of the Icarus paradox, the idea that overambition, or reaching too high, can sometimes lead to a self-destructive fall. Named after the myth of Icarus from Greek mythology, the paradox explores how ambition and the pursuit of greatness can be the very things that bring about an individual's downfall. Icarus, who flew too close to the sun despite his father's warnings, represents those who, driven by hubris or an unchecked desire for success, push beyond their limits, only to face the harsh consequences of their overreach. The paradox forces us to examine how pushing boundaries, in the pursuit of personal or professional greatness, can sometimes be the very thing that destroys what we have worked for. Can too much ambition ever be truly harmful? And what is the balance between reaching for the sky and knowing when to stop? Let's dive into the Icarus paradox, where ambition, success, and consequences intertwine in a cautionary tale. The Icarus paradox takes its name from the story of Icarus, a figure in Greek mythology who, along with his father Daedalus, was imprisoned in the labyrinth by King Minos. To escape, Daedalus crafted 2 pairs of wings made from feathers and wax, instructing Icarus not to fly too close to the sun or too close to the sea. However, Icarus, overwhelmed by the thrill of flight and the success of their escape, ignored his father's warning and flew higher and higher toward the sun. The heat of the sun melted the wax, causing Icarus to fall into the sea and drown. This myth has been interpreted as a metaphor for the dangers of hubris, overconfidence in one's abilities, and the consequences of disregarding warnings or limits. In modern contexts, the Icarus paradox represents the concept of individuals or organizations that, while reaching for greater success or ambition, fail to recognize when they have gone too far, or when their pursuit of greatness is self-destructive. The Icarus paradox has been applied in fields such as business, psychology, and philosophy, where overconfidence or overreach can lead to failure. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, illustrating that there can be consequences to pushing boundaries without recognizing the risks involved. The paradox underscores the tension between pursuing goals and knowing when to stop, between ambition and wisdom. The Icarus paradox speaks to the tension between the desire for success and the limits that should be respected. It asks the question of whether the drive to achieve greatness can sometimes lead to self-sabotage, and whether ambition unchecked can be the very thing that causes our downfall. In its modern applications, the paradox is not just about an individual's quest for personal success, but about the dangers of overreaching without a proper understanding of risks, boundaries, and limits. Ambition is a driving force that motivates individuals to achieve greater things, whether in their career, personal life, or creative endeavors. The desire to reach greater heights, to be recognized for success, and to fulfill personal goals is natural. It is often seen as a virtue, a key ingredient to success and growth. However, the Icarus paradox reveals the dangers of ambition when it is unchecked or becomes obsessive. Just as Icarus flew too close to the sun in his pursuit of freedom and greatness, individuals may push too hard toward their goals without considering the risks involved. This overreach, while fueled by positive intentions, often leads to failure, disillusionment, or even personal ruin. In the quest to become the best, we may inadvertently set ourselves on a path to destruction. Ambition, while powerful, is limited by our human capacity, both mentally and physically. No matter how hard we strive to exceed our limits, we must acknowledge that there are natural boundaries to our abilities. Pushing beyond those boundaries, like Icarus did with his wings, can result in catastrophic consequences. In modern terms, this idea can be seen in areas such as business, where entrepreneurs or companies sometimes overextend themselves in their pursuit of growth or market dominance, without properly assessing the consequences. The rise and fall of companies like Enron and Blockbuster are examples of organizations that pushed beyond their capacity, without recognizing the warning signs that their ambitions had become too grand or their decisions too risky. A key element of the Icarus paradox is the role of hubris, excessive pride or self-confidence. Icarus' mistake wasn't just that he flew too close to the sun, but that he ignored his father's warning, believing his success was inevitable. This overconfidence led him to disregard the limits of his wings and the natural forces, like the sun's heat, that were beyond his control. In modern contexts, hubris is often seen in individuals who, despite achieving success, believe that they are invincible or immune to failure. In the business world, this is evident in CEOs or leaders who push their companies too far, believing that their past success guarantees future success, often leading to their downfall. Overconfidence in one's own abilities without a sense of humility or awareness of limitations can lead to reckless decisions that push us toward failure, even when success initially seems certain. One of the central aspects of the Icarus paradox is the balance between innovation and risk management. In many fields, whether it's technology, business, or art, pushing boundaries and taking risks are essential for growth and innovation. Many of the world's greatest breakthroughs, such as the invention of the light bulb or the development of the internet, came from individuals who took risks and challenged the status quo. However, the paradox arises when those risks become too great. Innovation without a clear understanding of the risks or limits can lead to failure or even destruction. The question becomes, when is it appropriate to push the boundaries, and when should we recognize that we've gone too far? While innovation is key to progress, it's also essential to have an understanding of limits and fail-safes to avoid overreaching. A critical part of managing ambition is developing self-awareness. Knowing one's strengths and limitations is crucial to achieving success without falling prey to the dangers of overreach. The Icarus Paradox highlights how self-awareness can prevent individuals from overextending themselves or becoming too confident. Reflection and humility are necessary to understand where our limits lie and to recognize when pushing further would be harmful. Leaders in business, for example, must recognize when they've reached a saturation point or when further growth could lead to the organization's collapse. This awareness allows them to take calculated risks while avoiding the destructive overconfidence that leads to failure. The Icarus Paradox teaches us that failure is often a result of ambition gone unchecked. However, it is also a reminder that failure can be a learning experience. In some cases, failure is necessary for growth, as it forces individuals to reevaluate their approach, recognize their mistakes, and adapt for the future. Failure isn't necessarily the end of the road, but a catalyst for change. The key lies in how we react to failure. If we fail because we've overreached or been too ambitious, we can still learn from the experience and adjust our approach. The Icarus Paradox warns us that without self-awareness and humility, we may never have the chance to learn from our mistakes, and the consequences may be irreversible. Failure can also serve as a warning sign that we have gone too far or pushed too hard. Just as Icarus's fall was a direct consequence of ignoring his father's warnings, failure in our own endeavors can often be a direct result of ignoring the signs that we've reached our limits. These warning signs may come in the form of stress, burnout, or declining performance, but many individuals fail to recognize them until it's too late. The key is to recognize these signs early and take appropriate action before overreaching leads to irreversible consequences. The Icarus Paradox is evident in the business world, where companies that initially rise to great success sometimes fail due to overconfidence or a failure to recognize when they've pushed too far. Blockbuster, for example, once dominated the video rental market, but failed to adapt to the digital age and the rise of Netflix. Enron is another example of a company whose over-ambitious expansion and unethical practices ultimately led to its collapse. These companies pushed the boundaries of what was possible in their industries, but failed to recognize when they were overextending themselves, driven by the belief that their success could never end. The Icarus Paradox serves as a cautionary tale for companies about the importance of self-awareness, ethical decision-making, and recognizing limits. The paradox also applies to individuals in their personal lives and creative pursuits. Many artists, entrepreneurs, or scientists have suffered from overambition or overconfidence, leading them to take risks that ultimately undermine their success. The story of Icarus resonates with the modern desire to achieve greatness at any cost, but the true lesson is about finding a balance between ambition and self-awareness. The Icarus Paradox teaches us that while ambition can drive us towards success, it must be tempered with self-awareness, humility, and an understanding of our limits. Overreaching, whether in business, personal life, or creative pursuits, can be tempting, but it often leads to failure. By recognizing the warning signs, understanding our own limitations, and learning from setbacks, we can achieve success without falling prey to the dangers of unchecked ambition. Jevons Paradox. Imagine a world where technology becomes more efficient, allowing us to use less energy and resources to produce the same amount of output. On the surface, this should lead to savings and lower resource consumption, right? Yet, this is exactly where the Jevons Paradox comes in. A phenomenon that suggests greater efficiency can actually increase overall resource use rather than reduce it. The paradox is named after William Stanley Jevons, an English economist who observed in 1865 that as improvements in coal-burning technology made it more efficient, the overall demand for coal increased rather than decreased. How could using less energy per unit lead to greater overall consumption? The Jevons Paradox challenges our conventional wisdom about the relationship between efficiency and sustainability, suggesting that technological advancements in energy and resource use might not always lead to the environmental benefits we expect. In fact, as certain resources become cheaper and more accessible, demand for them may actually rise, exacerbating the very problem we are trying to solve. Let's explore the Jevons Paradox. where increased efficiency creates unexpected consequences in the race to conserve resources and protect the environment. The Jevons Paradox was first observed by William Stanley Jevons in his 1865 book The Coal Question, in which he analysed the relationship between technological progress and the consumption of coal, which was a primary energy source during the Industrial Revolution. Jevons found that as improvements in steam engine efficiency made the process of burning coal more effective, the demand for coal actually increased. This paradoxical result occurred because the efficiency gains in coal-burning technologies made coal a cheaper energy source, which in turn led to greater use of coal across industries. Jevons' observation contradicted the prevailing assumption that technological advancements in efficiency would necessarily result in less resource consumption. Instead, Jevons argued that technological efficiency might paradoxically lead to greater overall consumption, a conclusion that has become one of the most well-known paradoxes in environmental economics. The Jevons paradox raises fundamental questions about the impact of innovation and efficiency on resource use, and challenges the belief that sustainable technologies will always reduce environmental strain. Over time, the Jevons paradox has become a critical concept in discussions about sustainability, particularly in relation to the environmental impact of energy efficiency technologies. Researchers and policymakers have used the paradox to examine the unintended consequences of technological advancements in energy use, manufacturing, and resource management, especially when it comes to reducing carbon emissions and mitigating climate change. The Jevons paradox remains a fascinating and paradoxical concept in environmental economics and sustainability science. It reveals that improvements in resource efficiency, whether through technological advancements, innovation, or more efficient processes, do not always lead to lower consumption or sustainable resource management. In fact, they can sometimes lead to greater consumption and even exacerbate the very environmental issues they are intended to mitigate. This paradox underscores the complexity of the relationship between efficiency and sustainability in the modern world. Efficiency is typically understood as the ability to achieve a desired outcome with minimal input. In the context of resource use, efficiency often refers to the ability to use less energy, material, or time to produce the same or greater output. Energy efficiency technologies, such as more fuel-efficient cars or energy-saving appliances, are designed to reduce the amount of energy required to perform a task. The goal of energy efficiency is often to lower operating costs, reduce resource consumption, and in the case of environmental policy, minimize carbon emissions. By improving the performance of technology, it is believed that individuals, businesses, and governments can meet the same energy needs with fewer resources, leading to environmental benefits. At first glance, the logic seems straightforward. If we make something more efficient, we should use less energy or fewer resources to achieve the same output. For example, if a new fuel-efficient car consumes less gas for the same distance, the total fuel consumption should decrease, leading to lower overall demand for gasoline and a reduction in carbon emissions. Similarly, energy-efficient buildings should lead to lower energy costs, less waste, and reduced environmental footprints, as less energy is required to achieve the same levels of comfort. This principle of resource conservation through efficiency has underpinned many government policies and private sector initiatives aimed at promoting sustainability. Jevons' paradoxical finding emerged in the context of coal and the steam engine. As steam engines became more efficient in their use of coal, the demand for coal actually increased rather than decreased. This was because the cost of coal per unit of work was reduced, making it a more affordable and attractive energy source for a wider range of industries. For example, textile mills, iron smelters, and railroads that previously found coal use inefficient and costly were now able to expand their operations due to cheaper, more efficient engines. This led to an increase in overall demand for coal, which ultimately offset the benefits of the increased efficiency. Rather than conserving coal, the technological advancement led to its greater consumption. The same principle can be applied to other areas. As fuel-efficient cars are introduced, individuals may drive more often because the cost per mile decreases, and the reduction in fuel consumption may be offset by increased travel. Similarly, the development of energy efficiency appliances may lead to greater energy use, as the reduced cost of energy consumption encourages people to use appliances more frequently or purchase additional devices. The rebound effect is a term used to describe this phenomenon, where improvements in efficiency lead to increased consumption rather than decreased consumption. This can occur on both the microeconomic and macroeconomic levels. On the microeconomic level, the rebound effect occurs when individuals or businesses take advantage of the cost savings generated by efficiency improvements. For example, if a family installs energy-efficient lighting, they might be inclined to use more lights, run air conditioning longer, or increase the number of electronic devices they use, thus consuming more energy overall than they would have otherwise. On the macroeconomic level, the rebound effect can be seen when the adoption of efficient technologies leads to lower prices for goods and services that rely on those technologies. For example, the widespread adoption of solar panels may reduce the cost of electricity, leading to an increase in the demand for electricity-consuming technologies, such as electric vehicles or data centers. This can increase overall energy consumption, even though individual technologies are becoming more efficient. The Jevons paradox also highlights the indirect effects of efficiency improvements on resource consumption. While efficiency gains in one sector may reduce the use of certain resources, they can have spillover effects that increase consumption in other sectors. For example, the increased efficiency of transportation may lead to an expansion of freight networks, tourism, and personal mobility, thereby increasing the overall demand for transportation energy and vehicle production. Furthermore, as the demand for efficient technologies grows, manufacturers may shift their production towards these technologies, leading to a greater consumption of raw materials and energy in the manufacturing process. This indirect effect can offset the energy savings achieved by the technology itself. The Jevons paradox has profound implications for environmental policy and the pursuit of sustainability. While the development of energy-efficient technologies is essential for reducing the environmental impact of human activities, the paradox suggests that efficiency gains alone may not be sufficient to achieve substantial reductions in resource consumption or carbon emissions. If efficiency improvements lead to increased consumption, they may not significantly reduce the pressure on the planet's resources. Policymakers must therefore consider additional strategies, such as demand reduction, conservation, and lifestyle changes, to complement efficiency improvements. For example, encouraging public transportation, reducing consumerism, and promoting circular economies that minimize waste can help address the rebound effect. One potential solution to the Jevons paradox is the idea of decoupling economic growth from resource use. This means creating a system where the economy can continue to grow without increasing the consumption of resources or environmental degradation. Technologies like renewable energy, recycling, and resource-efficient production methods can help reduce the environmental impact of economic activity, but they must be coupled with policies that limit overall consumption. Achieving absolute decoupling, where resource use and carbon emissions are reduced even as the economy grows, requires a broad transformation in both technology and behavior. Global cooperation, green technologies, and systemic changes are necessary to mitigate the rebound effect and ensure that efficiency improvements contribute to genuine environmental benefits. The Jevons paradox is particularly relevant in the context of the climate crisis. Many of the technological solutions proposed to reduce carbon emissions, such as electric vehicles, renewable energy, and smart grids, can lead to a rebound effect if they result in increased energy use in other sectors. This means that while these technologies are necessary, they must be part of a broader strategy that also includes policy changes, lifestyle shifts, and global cooperation. The Jevons paradox underscores the challenge of relying solely on technological progress to solve environmental problems. While innovation is essential, it must be accompanied by efforts to reduce overall demand for resources and promote more sustainable lifestyles. In essence, technological efficiency is a part of the solution, but it is not a magic bullet. Leontief paradox. Imagine a country that, according to conventional economic theory, should be exporting capital-intensive goods and importing labor-intensive goods, based on its factor endowments, the amount of capital and labor it possesses. Now, imagine that this country does the exact opposite, exporting goods that are more labor-intensive while importing goods that are capital-intensive. This is the heart of the Leontief paradox, a surprising phenomenon in international trade that contradicts the Heckscher-Ohlin model of comparative advantage. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, a country should export goods that use its abundant factors, like labor or capital, and import goods that use its scarce factors. Yet, in 1953, economist Wassily Leontief found that the United States, one of the most capital-abundant countries in the world, was exporting labor-intensive goods and importing capital-intensive goods. How could this be? Why would a capital-rich country like the United States, with vast technological resources and capital assets, export products that require more labor rather than capital? The Leontief paradox challenges traditional notions of comparative advantage and forces us to rethink how global trade works. Let's explore the Leontief paradox, where economic theory and real-world trade patterns collide in an unexpected twist. The Leontief paradox is named after Vasily Leontief, a Russian-American economist who, in 1953, conducted an analysis of the trade patterns of the United States to test the validity of the Heckscher-Ohlin model of international trade. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, a country will specialize in the production and export of goods that use its abundant factors, such as labor, capital, or land, while importing goods that use its scarce factors. This theory suggests that capital-abundant countries should export capital-intensive goods and import labor-intensive goods. However, Leontief's research, based on input submission tables and data from 1947, contradicted this prediction. He found that despite the United States being one of the most capital-abundant nations in the world, it was exporting labor-intensive goods and importing capital-intensive goods. This was the basis of the Leontief paradox, which suggested that the Heckscher-Ohlin model could not fully explain the actual patterns of international trade. Leontief's findings were groundbreaking because they revealed that other factors, beyond just capital and labor, could influence trade patterns. His work prompted further research into the role of technology, human capital, and other non-traditional factors in shaping global trade. The paradox remains a key point of debate in international trade theory and has led to the development of alternative models of comparative advantage that incorporate broader factors of production and trade. The Leontief paradox is a key challenge to the Heckscher-Ohlin model of international trade, which assumes that factor endowments, the relative abundance of capital and labor, determine trade patterns. According to this model, a country with an abundance of capital, like the United States, should export capital-intensive goods and import labor-intensive goods, while a country with an abundance of labor should do the opposite. However, Leontief's findings contradicted this expectation, highlighting a key paradox in trade theory. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory is based on the concept of comparative advantage, which suggests that countries will specialize in producing goods that use their abundant factors of production. These factors could include labor, the availability of workers, capital, machinery, technology, and financial resources, land, natural resources, and land area. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin model, if a country is capital abundant, meaning it has more capital relative to labor, it should specialize in and export capital-intensive goods, goods that require more capital to produce. Conversely, a labor-abundant country should specialize in labor-intensive goods, goods that require more labor. For example, the United States, with its abundance of capital and technology, should export capital-intensive goods like machinery, electronics, and automobiles, while importing more labor-intensive goods like textiles or low-cost consumer products. The Heckscher-Ohlin model predicted that countries would follow this pattern of trade based on their factor endowments. This would lead to a more efficient allocation of resources globally, with countries specializing in industries where they have the greatest comparative advantage. In theory, this would lead to greater economic growth and international cooperation. The model was groundbreaking in its simplicity and elegance, yet it failed to account for some of the complexities of real-world trade patterns, as demonstrated by the Leontief paradox. Leontief's study focused on the trade patterns of the United States in the early post-World War II era. He used input-output tables, detailed data showing how industries interact with each other in the production process, to measure the relative capital and labor intensities of the goods that the US was exporting and importing. Using these tables, Leontief compared the capital intensity of US exports to that of imports. He expected to find that capital-intensive goods were being exported by the US, as predicted by the Heckscher-Ohlin model, and that labor-intensive goods were being imported. However, his findings were surprising. Leontief's research found that the United States, which was widely recognized as a capital-abundant country, was actually exporting labor-intensive goods and importing capital-intensive goods. This contradicted the prediction of the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, which would have suggested that the US should be exporting capital-intensive goods and importing labor-intensive ones. This finding, known as the Leontief paradox, prompted economists to question the assumptions of the Heckscher-Ohlin model and explore other factors that could influence trade patterns. One possible explanation for the Leontief paradox is the role of human capital and technology in determining trade patterns. While the United States may have been capital abundant, it also had an abundance of highly skilled labor, human capital, and a technologically advanced workforce. These factors could have made the production of labor-intensive goods in certain high-tech industries, such as electronics or software, more efficient than predicted by the Heckscher-Ohlin model. In this sense, it was not just the physical capital that mattered, but also the quality of the workforce and the technological innovations that allowed for the production of labor-intensive goods using high-tech methods. This may have led to the US exporting high-tech, labor-intensive goods such as computers and electronic equipment, which are both labor-intensive and require advanced capital. Another explanation is that the technological gap between countries could alter the capital-labor relationship. The technological prowess of the US could mean that even goods traditionally classified as labor-intensive, such as textiles or automobiles, were being produced more efficiently due to advanced machinery and automation. In this case, technological innovation could reduce the labor intensity of certain goods, thereby changing the way trade patterns should be understood. Another potential factor is the role of non-price factors in trade, such as market access, political relationships, and trade agreements. The US may have been exporting labor-intensive goods because these goods had a unique position in international markets, with established demand due to factors like brand recognition, quality, and foreign market preferences. For example, US cultural products such as movies and entertainment are labor-intensive but are exported heavily due to the country's strong cultural export market. The Leontief paradox may also reflect the role of capital mobility and foreign investment. The US has long been a hub for foreign direct investment, FD, with multinational companies operating in different parts of the world. This would mean that US companies, while operating in capital-intensive industries, might actually be exporting labor-intensive goods that were produced in foreign markets. In this case, the US could still be considered capital abundant, but the capital used in the production of labor-intensive goods may not be domestic capital. The Leontief paradox forced economists to re-evaluate the Heckscher-Ohlin model and consider the influence of non-traditional factors in trade. While factor endowments like labor and capital are important, factors such as human capital, technology, and global market access also play critical roles in determining a country's trade patterns. Economists have developed alternative models of trade that take into account these additional factors, such as the technology gap model, the Ricardian model of comparative advantage, and models that incorporate differentiated goods and increasing returns to scale. These models better account for the complexities of global trade than the original Heckscher-Ohlin framework. The paradox also underscores the importance of innovation and technological change in shaping trade patterns. As countries like the US continue to develop cutting-edge technologies and expertise, they may find themselves exporting goods that were previously thought to be labor-intensive, but simply due to the efficiencies gained from automation and advanced manufacturing processes. The Leontief paradox also invites a re-evaluation of the principle of comparative advantage. While traditional theories argue that countries should specialize in producing the goods that make the best use of their relative factor endowments, the paradox suggests that comparative advantage is not solely determined by factors like labor or capital, but also by technology, human capital, and the institutional frameworks that shape the global economy. Learner paradox. Imagine a world where, despite having a highly competitive market, prices are still rigid and sticky. In traditional economic theory, we would expect prices to fall in response to increased competition. However, in the learner paradox, we observe the opposite. Even when competition increases and new firms enter the market, prices do not decrease as expected. This paradox arises from the unexpected relationship between market power, pricing strategies, and economic regulation. According to traditional economics, when competition increases, prices should fall, benefiting consumers. But in the real world, we often see price stickiness. Prices do not adjust quickly or effectively, and sometimes they even increase despite greater competition. The learner paradox forces us to rethink how competition and market power interact, and challenges the simple notion that increased competition always results in lower prices. Is there more to market behavior than meets the eye? Could market structure, regulation, and pricing strategies be influencing outcomes in ways we haven't fully understood? Let's explore the learner paradox, where competition, market power, and pricing strategies create a fascinating contradiction in economic theory. The learner paradox was first proposed by the economist Abba Lerner in the mid-20th century. Lerner, a leading figure in post-Keynesian economics, was known for his work on price theory and market structure. The paradox emerged from Lerner's studies of the relationship between market power and price setting in oligopolistic markets dominated by a few large firms. Lerner's work highlighted an anomaly that was not fully explained by classical economics. In highly competitive markets, prices do not always behave as predicted. According to traditional neoclassical models, increased competition should lead to lower prices as firms fight for market share. However, Lerner noticed that prices often remained sticky or inflexible, even in the face of increased competition. This was especially noticeable in industries with few firms and where barriers to entry were low. The Lerner paradox was a challenge to conventional views of market efficiency, particularly the idea that competition always drives prices down. Lerner suggested that factors such as monopoly power, pricing strategies, and government regulation could all play significant roles in determining price levels in a competitive market. The paradox remains an important topic in discussions of market power, price regulation, and economic policy, especially in the context of antitrust economics. The Lerner paradox centers around the observation that prices in competitive markets do not always behave according to classical economic predictions. According to standard economic theory, an increase in competition, or the entry of new firms into a market, should naturally lead to a fall in prices. However, in reality, price stickiness is often observed where prices fail to adjust quickly or significantly, even in response to changes in market competition. This paradox challenges our understanding of how market structure and competition interact to influence pricing strategies, and forces economists to rethink the role of market power and regulation in modern economies. In traditional economic theory, markets are often assumed to function with perfect competition, a scenario where numerous firms produce identical products, and consumers can easily switch between them. In such a market, each firm is a price taker, meaning it has no power to set prices and must accept the market price determined by supply and demand. In this idealized system, if competition increases, for example through the entry of new firms, prices are expected to fall as firms lower their prices to attract customers. The introduction of competition drives downward pressure on prices, benefiting consumers and leading to market efficiency. This model is based on the assumption that competition leads to market equilibrium, where the price reflects the marginal cost of production and no firm can make excess profits. However, the Lerner paradox reveals that in many real-world markets, competition does not always lead to lower prices. This is particularly true in markets where oligopolistic competition exists, markets dominated by a small number of large firms. In these markets, firms may not have the same incentive to lower prices in the face of competition, because they often retain significant market power. Instead of driving prices down, firms in these markets may engage in price rigidity, where prices remain unchanged despite changes in market conditions. This can occur due to factors such as cost-plus pricing, where firms set prices based on their costs plus a markup, pricing strategies such as price leadership or tacit collusion, or sticky prices due to menu costs, the cost of changing prices frequently. These pricing strategies prevent the immediate or significant reduction in prices that would be expected in a perfectly competitive market. One of the key explanations for the Lerner paradox lies in the role of market power. In oligopolistic markets, where a few large firms control the market share, companies often have the ability to set prices above competitive levels, despite the presence of competitors. The Lerner Index, developed by Abba Lerner, measures the degree of monopoly power by comparing the difference between the price a firm charges and its marginal cost. In markets with limited competition, firms are not price takers but price setters, meaning they can adjust prices based on their market power and pricing strategies. Even in a market with several competitors, firms may not immediately lower their prices when new firms enter, because they can still maintain some level of control over the pricing structure through product differentiation, brand loyalty, and market segmentation. The concept of price rigidity is central to understanding the Lerner paradox. Price rigidity occurs when firms do not adjust their prices in response to changes in supply or demand. In competitive markets, this is often attributed to the costs associated with changing prices, known as menu costs. In oligopolistic markets, tacit collusion or price leadership may also lead to sticky prices, where firms avoid price cuts even in the face of increased competition. The paradox emerges because these strategies result in prices not falling as expected in the face of increased competition. Firms may opt to maintain high prices, relying on factors like advertising, product quality, or customer loyalty to maintain their market share. This behavior stands in contrast to the predictions of classical economic models, where increased competition should always result in lower prices. The learner paradox also highlights the complex relationship between market regulation and price behavior. In some cases, government interventions such as antitrust laws can play a role in preventing monopolistic behavior and promoting competition. However, antitrust interventions can have unintended consequences, especially when firms are able to find new ways to collaborate indirectly, e.g., price fixing, market segmentation, or product differentiation. In some cases, price regulation by the government may also inadvertently cause prices to remain high, especially in industries where regulation favors certain firms or encourages them to charge higher prices in the name of cost recovery or profit margins. This can create a paradoxical situation where government efforts to promote competition end up reinforcing high prices due to inefficiencies in the regulatory system. Despite the regulatory framework designed to ensure competitive pricing, price rigidity often persists due to factors such as oligopolistic market structures, corporate strategies, and the unwillingness of firms to engage in price competition. The learner paradox underscores the limitations of market regulation in achieving lower prices, especially in markets dominated by powerful firms with significant market share. The learner index is an important tool for assessing market power and price-setting behavior. The index is calculated as the difference between the price charged by a firm and its marginal cost, divided by the price. Learner index equals P/P, where P is the price charged by the firm, and MC is the marginal cost of production. The learner index ranges from 0 to 1, with a higher value indicating greater market power and the ability to set prices above competitive levels. In markets where competition is intense, the learner index tends to be low, suggesting that firms are price takers. In markets with less competition, i.e. oligopolistic or monopolistic markets, the index tends to be higher, indicating that firms have more control over prices. The learner paradox suggests that despite high learner index values, which would typically indicate high prices due to monopoly power, firms in these markets often fail to lower prices, even when competition increases. This paradox challenges traditional views that the learner index is always a reliable predictor of price behavior. The learner paradox highlights the need for a more nuanced understanding of market competition and pricing strategies. Economic policy, particularly antitrust regulation, must account for the complexity of pricing behavior in markets where oligopolies or monopolies exist. Policymakers need to consider not just the number of firms in a market, but also the degree of market power they hold and how their pricing strategies may affect consumer welfare. The paradox also raises questions about the role of price regulation in promoting lower prices. While traditional economic theory suggests that more competition leads to lower prices, the reality is more complex. In some cases, increased competition may lead to higher prices or price rigidity due to the influence of market power and pricing strategies. The learner paradox calls for a deeper examination of how market structure, pricing strategies, and regulation interact to influence economic outcomes. By understanding the complexities of price stickiness, market power, and government regulation, economists and policymakers can better address the challenges of market efficiency and consumer welfare in modern economies. Lucas paradox. In a world where global markets are interconnected and capital can flow freely across borders, the expectation is that poorer countries would receive the investment they need to spur economic growth. However, a surprising phenomenon, known as the Lucas paradox, suggests otherwise. Despite the ability of capital to move freely, we observe that capital flows often move from developing countries to developed ones, rather than the other way around. The paradox lies in the fact that capital, the very factor necessary to boost productivity and growth in developing economies, tends to flow in the opposite direction. Why is it that rich countries receive the lion's share of foreign direct investment, FDI, even though poorer countries are in dire need of it? According to economic theory, capital should flow to where it is scarce and needed most, to poorer countries, where the marginal return on investment is highest. Yet, the Lucas paradox defies this expectation and forces economists to rethink how capital mobility, risk, and development interact on the global stage. How can we explain this disconnect between capital allocation and economic growth? Let's explore the Lucas paradox, where the free movement of capital creates unexpected outcomes in the pursuit of global economic development. The Lucas paradox was first introduced by economist Robert Lucas in 1990 as a theoretical puzzle in the field of international economics. Lucas observed that despite the standard economic theory suggesting that capital should flow from rich, capital-abundant countries to poor, capital-scarce countries in need of investment, the actual pattern of foreign direct investment, FDI, was quite the opposite. Instead, the flow of capital largely went from developing countries to developed ones, creating an apparent paradox. Lucas noted that this paradox persisted despite predictions from neoclassical growth theory and endogenous growth models that capital should naturally flow to poorer countries where the marginal return on investment would be higher due to capital scarcity. His work, which was based on analysis of the global patterns of investment flows, highlighted a disconnect between economic theory and the reality of capital allocation. The paradox generated extensive debate in the economics community about the determinants of capital flows, risk, and the role of institutions in shaping economic outcomes. Over time, the Lucas paradox became a key topic in the study of development economics, prompting economists to investigate the role of institutional quality, economic policies, and risk factors in influencing capital movements. Despite the paradox's origins in theoretical economics, it has significant implications for global development and international finance, as it highlights the complexities that affect how capital is distributed globally. The Lucas paradox challenges the traditional understanding of how capital flows should work in the global economy. According to neoclassical economics, capital should naturally flow from rich countries, where it is abundant, to poorer countries, where it is scarce, in order to maximize the marginal returns on investment. This would lead to increased productivity, growth, and development in developing countries. Yet, in reality, the flow of capital often runs in the opposite direction. Wealthy countries tend to receive the bulk of foreign investment, even though they do not need it as much. Several factors contribute to this paradox, ranging from economic theories about risk and returns to the role of institutions, political stability, and historical factors. Let's examine the underlying reasons for the Lucas paradox and the various factors that contribute to the unexpected movement of capital. In the neoclassical growth model, one of the central assumptions is that capital is mobile and should naturally flow from capital-abundant regions to capital-scarce regions. According to this model, capital mobility should lead to convergence in income levels between rich and poor countries, as investment flows from high-return, developed countries to lower return, developing countries. In this model, the marginal return on capital is higher in developing countries because capital is relatively scarce and its potential for increasing productivity is greater. Therefore, if capital were allocated according to the principles of optimal investment and economic efficiency, it should flow to those countries where it is needed most, contributing to growth and development. However, empirical evidence shows that capital flows often defy these expectations. In fact, developed countries, with their high levels of capital stock, often receive the largest share of foreign direct investment, FDI. This creates the Lucas paradox, a situation where investment flows to capital-rich nations despite the expectation that it should flow to capital-scarce, developing nations. The paradox is particularly evident in foreign direct investment, FDI, which is a key source of capital inflows for developing countries. Despite the fact that marginal returns on investment should be higher in poorer countries, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan continue to attract the lion's share of global capital. This discrepancy challenges the basic assumptions of neoclassical growth theory and highlights the complexity of global investment dynamics. One of the key explanations for the Lucas paradox is the role of risk in investment decisions. While the economic theory suggests that capital should flow to where returns are highest, the risks associated with investing in developing countries often outweigh the potential returns. Developing nations are often perceived as riskier investments due to factors such as political instability, poor governance, weak legal systems, and volatile economic conditions. Investors, particularly in the form of foreign direct investment, often prefer to put their capital in stable, well-regulated markets where the risks are lower. This is particularly true when the return on investment in developed countries is still relatively high, even if it is lower than in poorer nations. In many cases, the risks associated with investing in developing countries, including risks related to corruption, expropriation, inflation, and currency fluctuations, outweigh the potential benefits of higher returns. The preference for politically stable and economically predictable environments explains why capital continues to flow to developed countries, despite the theoretical expectation that it should flow to poorer nations with higher marginal returns. This risk aversion is a central factor in the Lucas paradox. Another important factor that influences capital flows is the quality of institutions in a country. Strong institutions, such as well-functioning legal systems, property rights, and financial regulations, reduce the risks associated with investment and increase the attractiveness of a country for foreign capital. Developed countries, particularly those in North America and Western Europe, tend to have stronger institutions and better governance systems. In contrast, many developing countries suffer from weak institutions, which increase the uncertainty surrounding investments. The Lucas paradox can therefore be partly explained by the fact that institutional quality in developing countries often does not meet the standards that international investors expect. For example, corruption, inefficient public services, and a lack of rule of law in many developing countries make them less attractive to investors, even though these countries might theoretically offer higher returns on investment. This is why institutional reform is often a key focus in development economics. Improving governance can help attract foreign investment and reduce the paradox of capital flows. The history of colonization and the legacy of imperialism in many developing countries also play a role in the Lucas paradox. Many developing nations were once colonies of European powers and still carry the historical baggage of economic systems that were designed to extract resources rather than foster local economic growth. The impact of colonialism on the economic structures of these countries has had lasting effects on their ability to attract investment. Countries that were colonized often had their economic systems oriented toward extracting natural resources and exporting goods to the colonial powers, rather than developing a diverse economy that could attract long-term capital. This historical legacy contributes to the difficulties these countries face in developing stable, diversified economies that would attract foreign direct investment. Social factors, such as the role of culture and social networks, can also influence capital flows. In many developing countries, social capital, such as informal networks, family ties, and local trust systems, often plays a greater role in economic transactions than formal institutions. While these informal systems can foster local economic activity, they do not necessarily promote the global mobility of capital. In contrast, developed countries tend to have formal markets, legal systems, and financial institutions that facilitate the flow of capital across borders. These formal institutions reduce transaction costs and information asymmetries, making developed countries more attractive to international investors. The Lucas paradox has significant implications for global development. It highlights the difficulties that developing countries face in attracting foreign direct investment and achieving economic growth, even when traditional economic models suggest that they should be the recipients of such investment. The paradox suggests that developing countries may need to focus not just on offering higher returns to attract capital, but also on addressing the institutional and social barriers that hinder foreign investment. To overcome the Lucas paradox, it is essential for developing countries to focus on improving institutional quality, reducing corruption, and strengthening the rule of law. These reforms would make these countries more attractive to international investors, even if the returns on investment are not as high as in other regions. Countries like China and India have demonstrated that institutional reforms, combined with economic liberalization and trade openness, can help attract capital and facilitate sustained growth. The Lucas paradox is a reminder that the global distribution of capital is not solely driven by economic theory, but is also deeply influenced by political, social, and institutional factors. Mandeville's paradox. What if I told you that selfishness, greed, and vice, traditionally seen as moral failings, could be the driving forces behind economic prosperity and social progress? This is the essence of the Mandeville's paradox, which suggests that actions driven by individual self-interest can lead to greater collective good. In his famous work, The Fable of the Bees, 18th century philosopher Bernard Mandeville argued that society thrives when individuals pursue their own selfish desires, even if these desires lead to behaviors deemed immoral. In fact, Mandeville suggested that vices like greed, luxury, and self-indulgence are not only inevitable, but also necessary for the advancement of commerce, trade, and economic development. The paradox arises from the tension between moral virtue and economic success. Can society truly benefit from actions that are morally questionable, or is there something inherently wrong about the idea that vice can lead to prosperity? Let's explore the Mandeville's paradox, where moral failings and economic success collide in a complex interplay of self-interest and social benefit. The Mandeville's paradox is rooted in the ideas of Bernard Mandeville, an 18th century Dutch philosopher and satirist. In his seminal work, The Fable of the Bees, published in 1714, Mandeville presented a provocative argument about the role of vice in economic prosperity. At the time, many thinkers believed that a society's moral health, rooted in virtue and selflessness, was the foundation of economic well-being. Mandeville, however, challenged this conventional wisdom by arguing that it was not the virtue of individuals, but rather their vices, such as greed, luxury, and envy, that contributed to the flourishing of commerce and the overall prosperity of society. Mandeville famously claimed that private vices lead to public benefits, meaning that individuals driven by self-interest and personal gain contribute to the greater good by inadvertently promoting economic activity. In his view, the accumulation of wealth, the growth of trade, and the advancement of society were driven by the selfish pursuits of individuals, and these pursuits had positive consequences for society as a whole. Mandeville's ideas were controversial, as they conflicted with the prevailing belief that a moral society was essential for economic stability. Critics accused him of advocating for immorality, but his work paved the way for later economic theories, including the ideas of Adam Smith and the invisible hand of market forces. The Mandeville's paradox continues to spark debates about the relationship between ethics and economics, and whether moral behavior is always aligned with economic success. The Mandeville's paradox challenges the traditional belief that moral virtue is the key to economic prosperity and societal well-being. Instead, Mandeville argued that society benefits when individuals pursue their selfish desires, even if these desires lead to vices. This paradox presents a complex relationship between vice, virtue, and economic success, suggesting that what we often view as immoral may actually contribute to the greater good. To explore this paradox, we must examine the components of Mandeville's argument and its implications for understanding economic systems, social morality, and human behavior. Mandeville's central thesis was that private vices lead to public benefits. He argued that individuals, by pursuing their selfish desires, whether in the form of greed, luxury, or ambition, create economic opportunities that benefit society at large. In his view, greed leads to entrepreneurship. The desire for wealth drives innovation, trade, and industrial growth. Luxury encourages people to spend money, fueling consumer demand, which in turn stimulates production and economic activity. For Mandeville, these self-entrusted actions are beneficial to society because they boost the economy and create wealth. For example, the desire for luxury goods leads to the creation of markets and jobs which contribute to economic development. While this may seem like a contradiction, where selfish behavior leads to collective prosperity, Mandeville pointed out that the pursuit of individual pleasure could, in fact, generate a virtuous cycle of economic growth. In this sense, vice becomes a driving force for progress. Mandeville's ideas laid the groundwork for the later development of capitalist thought. Although Mandeville did not use the term invisible hand, his ideas closely resemble Adam Smith's famous concept. According to Smith, individuals acting in their own self-interest unintentionally contribute to the greater good through the operation of market forces. Just as Smith argued that individuals seeking to maximize their own benefit end up benefiting society as a whole, Mandeville contended that private vices which seem morally objectionable lead to public benefits. This idea challenges the assumption that morality and economics are always aligned. In fact, it suggests that immoral actions, when viewed through an economic lens, might serve societal needs. Mandeville's paradox forces us to rethink the relationship between individual morality and social well-being. suggesting that society may actually flourish due to the selfish behaviors of its members. Mandeville's paradox was especially controversial because it ran counter to the moral views of the time. In the early 18th century, many philosophers and theologians believed that society's moral health was the foundation for economic stability and social harmony. Virtue, as seen in selflessness and charity, was considered the highest good, and greed was often equated with moral corruption. Capitalism, as we understand it today, was still in its early stages, and there was little recognition of the economic value of self-interest in the way that later thinkers would come to understand. Mandeville's views were particularly contentious because they seemed to endorse behaviors that were traditionally seen as immoral, such as greed, luxury, and self-indulgence, as essential to economic growth. His satirical style was also seen as an affront to the prevailing moral order, and his ideas sparked widespread debate. Critics of Mandeville's paradox accused him of promoting licentiousness and vice as desirable qualities, undermining the traditional moral foundations of society. Despite the controversy, Mandeville's ideas had a significant impact on the development of political economy and capitalist thought. By suggesting that selfish desires could contribute to public prosperity, Mandeville opened the door for later thinkers to explore the role of self-interest in economic systems. His paradox provided a new perspective on how individual actions could shape the collective good, a concept that would later be refined by thinkers like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Mandeville's paradox also resonated with emerging capitalist economies, where the desire for profit and wealth accumulation was central to economic growth. Over time, the idea that individuals acting in their self-interest could contribute to societal prosperity became a cornerstone of market economies. The Mandeville's paradox exposes a fundamental tension between moral virtue and economic prosperity. If self-interest and vice lead to economic success, then is it possible that virtue, selflessness, generosity, and altruism actually hinders economic progress? According to Mandeville, virtue might even be counterproductive to the economy, because if individuals focused solely on moral ideals, they would neglect the self-interested actions that drive commercial activity and wealth creation. This paradox challenges our moral intuitions. Many people believe that virtuous behaviors such as honesty, generosity, and hard work should lead to a better society, both morally and economically. However, Mandeville's argument suggests that immoral actions, like greed and selfishness, may actually be more conducive to economic success than virtuous behavior. This raises the question, should we prioritize moral virtue over economic growth? Or can we accept that selfishness can sometimes result in a better society? Mandeville's paradox also highlights the role of social norms and expectations in shaping behavior. In societies where moral virtue is valued above all else, individuals may suppress their selfish desires in favor of altruism and charity. However, this suppression may limit economic development and growth. On the other hand, in societies where self-interest is encouraged and even celebrated, individuals may be more likely to pursue actions that lead to economic progress, even if those actions are seen as morally questionable. The Mandeville's paradox invites us to question whether economic prosperity can truly be achieved through the pursuit of moral virtue, or whether it requires a more pragmatic approach that embraces the role of vice in driving economic success. The Mandeville's paradox continues to be relevant in today's capitalist world, where the pursuit of profit, competition, and self-interest often drives economic innovation and growth. The paradox raises questions about the moral implications of capitalism. If greed and selfishness lead to economic prosperity, does that justify actions that may harm others or society at large? Can we reconcile the pursuit of wealth with the desire for a more equitable, just society? In the context of global capitalism, Mandeville's paradox highlights the tension between individual success and social responsibility. The pursuit of personal wealth and success often leads to inequality, environmental degradation, and social unrest, but it also drives innovation, job creation, and economic development. The Mandeville's paradox presents an ethical dilemma for modern economies. Should we encourage self-interest and entrepreneurial spirit, even if it leads to economic inequality and environmental harm? Or should we prioritize virtue and collective well-being, even if it means sacrificing economic growth? This debate is central to discussions about economic policy, corporate responsibility, and sustainable development. The Mandeville's paradox challenges the assumption that moral virtue and economic prosperity are always aligned. It forces us to reconsider the role of self-interest and vice in driving economic progress and social welfare. While the paradox remains controversial, it offers valuable insights into the complex relationship between ethics, economics, and human behavior. Ultimately, the Mandeville's paradox reminds us that economic growth is not a simple result of virtuous behavior, but a complex interplay of individual desires, social expectations, and market forces. Understanding this paradox is essential for navigating the ethical dilemmas that arise in modern economies, where the pursuit of self-interest can both contribute to prosperity and create significant social challenges.